Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It is the 58th episode of The Big Boys Table, and I am joined by the big boy, IskatuMesk's.
Hi.
We're going to be talking about Apex X, which is IskatuMesk's ARPG, if we can even say the word ARPG, of course. We had the interview on the No Frauds Club channel where we talked about the genre being silly, but I did want to ask you about, even before we get into the specifics of the project, we're going to be doing some screen share. It's going to be one of the first Big Boys Tables in a while where we actually have some visual stuff, so strap yourselves in for that, audience members. But I did want to ask you about your names because I was always curious as to I assumed that the actual changes in letters had some bearing on, like, basically based on the position of the alphabet you're in is how many iterations it's gone. And if it's at X, it's at the end of the alphabet. So what's going on there?
So, well, X takes a little bit of a jump, but it did take us many jumps to get to that point. So the history for Apex X is actually really long. It starts all the way back in Warcraft 3, actually, way back in like 2005, 2006. Started with something I called the GEC Gameplay Elements concept. That was kind of, back then, because RTS really wasn't working out in Warcraft 3 because of the pathing and the AI and stuff.
Yep.
I was trying a lot of different things. I tried the MOBA thing, but the way I had approached it at the time was that you played as a hero, but the world environment still played as an RTS. Everything was governed by RTS mechanics. You had allied bases, enemy bases, and they built and harvested resources and stuff like that. That eventually evolved into something called Starsworn, which was, it didn't have a real shape at the time, but it was kind of the idea of you controlling one unit in a living world. The living world concept is also often what I called it. That kind of just brewed in the background of all the other stuff. Obviously, I did Black Sun and then Armageddon Onslaught. And we hit StarCraft 2. Armageddon Onslaught 2 was immediately canned when Blizzard said they weren't going to be supporting mods. And that was a multiplayer project that needed to have mod support. And StarCraft 2 didn't have that because they introduced CRC checking. They killed folder hot loading, all the other stuff that allows mods to exist. So Armageddon Onslaught then tried to pivot into a third-person single-player campaign that was deduced to be impossible because of the performance yet again. And then that kind of stewed. Apex came out shortly after that. Apex actually originated as a spin-off, like a reimagination, if you will, of StarCraft. Humor-oriented, kind of like a lot of my older projects from like 2002, 2003. But it took the StarCraft stuff because basically I stripped out all the ambitions of Armageddon Onslaught. I tried to downscale stuff to StarCraft 2's level because StarCraft 2 could only support about 100 units at a time moving around before the whole thing began to really screech to a halt. And of course, at the time, we didn't have official tools for 3D graphics either. We wouldn't have the official plugin for 3ds Max until I think it was 2014 or something, like 4 years after the game came out, which was obviously that helped kill what little bit of a scene there might have been. But Apex endured a lot, evolving from concept to concept to concept. So Apex A was very much like I imagined. And Apex was kind of like, okay, so all my older projects prior to that, Black Sun, for example, they were all based on a world that I had made way back. I'd started writing in that in the early 90s, called Throne of Armageddon. And Apex was something completely independent. It was more like my Lowlands of Legend world. If you're familiar with that, with the more lighthearted, less serious, therefore less demanding in world I devised for my Age of Wonders 2 total conversion, and some Warcraft 3 stuff. Apex was similar in that regard. It was a child of the times, and it would change concepts as I continued to do research and development in the StarCraft. And that's where the numbers come from, or the letters. It's actually late. It's early for ProtoGo. It's really late for me. So Apex A is like your early one. That's actually when I had you do voice acting for way back, too, because I was building conceptual cinematics at the time.
Right.
And that's when we first got into AI. That's when I had ARPGs with me. And he bailed pretty quickly, actually, due to IRL problems, and then never showed his face ever again. But we had basically deduced that nothing that we wanted could be done within the editor alone. You had to use the actual melee for it. And then there was a year and a half where I waited on him. And then we have the sort of nebulous area between Apex A and Apex B. And honestly, I don't remember that because that was around the time that I got into Retribution. We're actually going to talk a little bit about Retribution a little bit later, so I won't get into that now, but Retribution was obviously a huge project, and I probably have talked about it to some extent in past casts. There was a long-running machinima / independent film kind of attempt, and someone said they were going to help me do character models, and we're going to talk about character models and how much of a shit show that's been, not just for Retribution, but for this as well. They just gaslit me, I guess, and then I wasted like a year and a half of my time, but that was just a year and a half of nonstop work. I left Sins of a Solar Empire, 2014, 2013 happened, got evicted, and ended up here. Went back into StarCraft 2 during downtime. We got into something called Apex C, which is really one of the big ones. Apex C and Apex F are both hypothetical action RPG concepts that are really the main ones that take us to today. So Apex, although it changes a lot between campaign concept to campaign concept, those two action RPG concepts, Apex C and F, actually had scripts written out for them containing game mechanics, and it was the first time I had sat down and written down all these things in my head that had stewed since all the way back in Warcraft 3. And of course, I'd been doing Let's Plays for all this time after about 2010. A very large chunk of them had been action RPGs, including Souls, DMC, God of War. And throughout all those, I just saw so much wasted potential left and right, just wasted potential everywhere. Where you would have some games like, let's say, Demon's Souls, that would have like interesting aesthetics, but then the gameplay and the AI were terrible. Or then you had like God of War, where some of the graphics were good, but then the gameplay was terrible. You had DMC 3, which had some decent gameplay in it, but then like there's so many things that could have been just done so much better if people had just given a shit. And then Dragon's Dogma was another very pivotal one, which I believe you're actually thinking about getting into.
Yeah, that'll be my next title, I believe, that I give a run to. Obviously, recently played the ill-fated Star Wars game.
Yeah. Did you go through the whole thing, or did you rage quit?
Oh, I didn't record the rest of my playthrough, but I did give it a shot, because it's like one of those things that you figure it takes a lot more effort to try to stop and talk about how like all the when I play a game, it's similar to you in that way, where it's like I would prefer the playthrough to contain something of value in terms of education or at least humor. There wasn't much humor besides me dying to all of the dialogue, but the educational content actually does take a lot of effort to do because of how bad everything is. You have to like break everything down from first principles, which, I mean, that's one of the reasons why that series called Just Let Me Play even exists, where it's just me trying to play something, not being able to, and then calling it quits after one segment. So it's like a bunch of like trying out this. You could kind of, when you had like the graveyard up or whatever, where it's just like a bunch of one-time recordings or what have you, is kind of similar. So, I played that. I guess some games that you may not have taken a look at yet, obviously sort of more evocative of Assassin's Creed than anything is those Shadow of Mordor and Shadow of War games, which I don't know if you have any knowledge of, but that's another.
Have heard that at least one of them, I don't know which one, but one of them you can just go through pushing a QTE button between enemies without even looking at the screen, just systematically killing everything on the map. I've seen someone do that in one of those games.
I haven't seen that actually, so I don't even know which one it would be, but I do know that basically the game, like, those games are basically the epitome of, like, useless grind.
Yeah.
But also, something that happens, I believe, even in God of War and such.
Oh, yeah.
Is that you'll get through these situations where in the games, your character will, like, go through some story thing that, like, invalidates some of their actions or makes them lose their power or whatever. In the Jedi game, you get captured and you don't have your lightsaber for this stupid puzzle sequence where there's no threat, obviously. It's not like you could die to enemies if you fuck up. It's just this empty puzzle. It's very, that game is very academic. Obviously, it's got, like, the incidental or not, it's got like the diversity checkbox stuff. It obviously has all of the dialogue just be like super basic. All the sequences are
all the
incredibly stupid. There's a Darth Vader cameo at the very end that doesn't even make sense. Obviously,
it's Star Wars. You gotta have Darth Vader.
And then
otherwise you wouldn't know it's Star Wars.
The whole cast of characters is such a weird freak show. And then it also has the ending zone, which is not really that large, which, like, the whole game is actually very short. And the zone that you go to at the end, so there's, like, a travel mechanic in a lot of these games. And in this particular case, you can travel between planets, which sounds like it would be high scale, but really it's no different than just traveling between continents or something.
No.
And you except for the fact that they're not connected. So ironically, it actually feels like a smaller world.
It
feels like a less seamless
the tile
world.
sets, really.
Yeah. It's like and then you have like a loading system, basically. There's this weird thing about it where you're in a ship and you have to sit in your ship's like front seat in order to land, which is like, I don't know why.
That's advanced space age technology. Got to have your seatbelt firmly attached.
I guess it was because that if you're like in the middle of doing something, they didn't want to interrupt you from that to watch the landing cutscene. But they could have solved that by not having a landing cutscene and just have it happen. Or the other option would be to, I don't know, like push some button instead of having because you can't even run inside the ship. So you have to walk slowly from wherever you are to the front cockpit. It's just like, why did nobody think of something better? So there's all sorts of little things like that just really get my goat, and it would be nice if that didn't happen. So anyway, but the fast travel stuff aside, it's like there's different zones. The final zone you don't get to go to before the end of the game, and then you can't go back there. So that's like a trope that happens all the time. Except I think in this game there was some pop-up message that said that like you've been teleported to before the last fight happens. And you can't go to the last fight because it's over, but you can do like New Game Plus or whatever. And I was really confused. Or you can like recomplete stuff. And then there was New Game Plus as like a separate feature. I was just very confused about that. It's like one of the things that happens in all these games is that you get some sort of progression mechanic, and New Game Plus is basically just play the game over, but have everything unlocked, and that maybe there's some harder in air quotes enemies, which just translates to enemies.
Usually just ramps up the stats.
Yeah.
I don't understand New Game Plus, honestly. I don't really get it. I mean, usually these games don't have enough substance between the beginning and the end of them to that would warrant a new experience, because you were playing the same game at the end that you were at the beginning anyways.
Well, yeah, usually they don't have enough content for the first game, let alone another playthrough, you know what I mean? Like, it's just silly. So I was kind of curious. I mean, that opens up a couple cans of worms here, but and obviously I'm curious as to what you'll do for a lot of different specific features. Like, are you going to have fast traveling? Is there going to be different zones in that sense? Or is it going to be more conventional, like a campaign sequence? Because you were saying you have like a demo level ready to look at.
Yeah, so I will talk a little bit about that, but I have to say that a lot of that I'm not entirely sure yet. Originally, I was going to have it be completely linear, but now I'm considering having it be like Dark Souls, where there are different directions you can go in that unlock as time goes on. But I think a lot of that also really depends on ultimately what I let you get for abilities and stuff like that. So I do have a demo to show, but this demo is very bare bones. It's mostly as a way to set a foundation and show, hey, this is what I've done. So the problem with Apex, of course, is that, as is evident by that, the story leading up to this point is it's very volatile. Nothing really sat down because of StarCraft 2 being a heaping pile of shit. But I was really stubborn because I made every single game I worked with bend to my will eventually. Warcraft 3, StarCraft, Diablo 2 to an extent. I did have too many issues with the hardcode in Diablo 2, but today I have people I could talk to about that if I really want to get into it. StarCraft 2 to an extent, but I reached the end, the limits of what StarCraft 2 could do. I firmly believe that between HKS and myself, we are completely unapproached in terms of technical art ability in that game, and there was nobody else who was even willing to get into AI other than Turtles, who was manually triggering it throughout all the years, all the way up until 2019, that I was dealing with AI in that game. And I mean, we got into this subject a few times by now. I did help third-party projects, but I ultimately couldn't get the game to work for myself. But I was so stubborn that I felt like if I just kept slamming my head into it, things would improve. And then it obviously never happened. And then 2019 happened, and I did discuss when we started doing these podcasts again the insanity that began really taking shape at that point. And then the decision I made as a result to get into Unreal 4. So I had been doing Unreal 4 stuff prior to that, but it was either D&D maps or there's a few experiments, some of which I'm going to show in this demo just for the sake of just showing, again, putting in groundwork. So what I'm going to be showing is just showing what the mechanics are. And then this will, especially for you, I think, serve as a good point of reference for the direction that this project is going to go in as opposed to the Star Wars game you just played. Because you're probably going to see some very similar kind of concepts, but the way that they're done is completely different than what I intentionally choose not to have, especially in terms of navigation, is a really big thing, I think, that can really open up a lot to get into. Because I haven't watched too much of that video. I skimmed it at the time, and I noticed that you have to have the Prince of Persia kind of movement set. You have the wall running, the climbing. You have to have the wall climbing. Ever since God of War introduced this, every one of these games has to have the wall climbing, and it is so pointless to have.
And, well, hey, the wall running actually gets unlocked by you having a flashback where you remember being a kid and wall running, and for some reason you need to do that for everything that you do. So you learn how to double jump by being a kid. You learn how to...
it's funny you should say that, because that's actually how you're going to be unlocking parts of stuff in this. But the flashbacks are actually fragments of your memory, like actual fragments of your memory that are scattered across the world. So I guess the same idea, but very, very different context.
Yeah, instead of just like suddenly it conveniently being the time that you remember something because you have to use it now, it's like
you have to actually seek it out.
Presumably more grounded in the world where you found something that triggers it or whatever. But yeah.
So on that note, Apex's setting took a lot of shape, specifically with Apex C and Apex F. They're the ones I'm going to reference to a lot. The last one to have StarCraft's related stuff, and it was Apex J that was actually, and then Apex U. Those were two very similar, those were the StarCraft 2 projects I was actually talking about, probably within this podcast. In earlier ones, I talked to some extent about the world and the setting and the Terrans and stuff like that. That is where that came from. Yeah. Is
for the audience, you may remember the original, like some of the older episodes of the Big Boys Table took place when Apex J was in development, and then when there was like a hiatus before the more recent hiatus, and then when we came back, so in the middle or whatever, the middle episodes are probably more related to. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking like 30 plus episodes. 30 plus are probably Apex U, and then obviously more recently, since the second, the third recoming or whatever. Yeah, that's X. So yeah, U.
So Apex X. I have been working on Apex X, and I say off and on very strongly since the end of 2019. So you could say this has about 3 years of real-time development placed into it, but that actually only equates to about 5 months of actual production days placed into it. So in a sense, we're very bare bones, but what I have noticed is that what I do have is comparable to what many people have with 2 years, 3 years of actual development, of actual committed development, and in many ways is superior to a lot of the demonstrational, educational, and mentorship content I'm noticing on the internet. But there are definitely weak spots. So I'll give a little bit of a disclaimer when we get into it. But although there has been a long time since this was initiated, it has not actually seen a lot of work in it. And I'm going to kind of talk about why. But with Apex X, it's when you talk about the educational stuff, the first thing I thought about is Doom Eternal. How that game was so unbelievably bad that literally...
think about how much effort you had to put in to explain why everything was bad.
Every time I started a zone, I would spend up to an hour not even moving like 5 fucking feet from where you started, just pointing out all the things that were wrong. And then when it got to like the fights and stuff like that, everything was just so overwhelmingly bad that you didn't really... I spent time analyzing stuff, but it was getting to the point where it was just too much even for me to go through. I was looking at like 9-hour breakdowns for every fucking area. And, when I try to go into my project, it's like, I try to be that critical as well, but I come into this with no programming and no artist abilities. I'm neither a programmer nor am I an artist. I have technical art skills in Sins of a Solar Empire, StarCraft 2, and stuff like that. And I had done modeling since 2001, but I had no success with them. The most I got was box modeling for Retribution, some of which I will show in this. I learned porting in Warcraft 3, and I am a modder, and a lot of the stuff we're going to be showing in this and talking about are ports that I've otherwise edited or modified. Secretly, I'm kind of hoping an experienced character modeler will just come out of nowhere and offer their services for free, so I don't have to use ports for the player character in particular, but yeah, not going to happen. So we work with what we've got, but the limits of my abilities in terms of programming and artisanry are very, very evident all throughout this. I can do anything in StarCraft 2. Because in StarCraft 2, you can get away with like kit bashing and stuff like that. With this, it's more difficult. So you were talking about, before we got into this, you were talking about reads and stuff like that. So
yes,
beyond just the reads aspect, the animations and the graphics, all those are very, very important. And I'm thinking of where we can go from this, but when I get into this project, initially, I had very low expectations for the project. My target goal was for it to look as good as Lineage 2, because I was taking graphics from Lineage 2, or modified World of Warcraft in PBR, physically based rendering as it's called, and having better consistency in those games, because both of them were extremely inconsistent. But that's kind of like the target quality I was aiming for. With a lot of really key major differences that will be very actually evident right away, I think, for anybody who's familiar with Unreal. And at the time, of course, I was dealing exclusively with ported animations and ported textures and everything like that. My expectations were as such as that I probably wouldn't be able to expand past that. As I will soon demonstrate. Actually, immediately from the get-go, I was trying to reanimate stuff by hand, bone by bone, frame by frame, within 3ds Max without a rig. I actually didn't even know what a rig was when I got into this project. So I was using the Worgen female graphic for the player character because that was an asset I had some experience in retooling and fixing for Armageddon Onslaught, because I was going to use that for a character. In Armageddon Onslaught, I used a newer model that was released at that time. I had to redo a lot of that work. I'm going to actually show both of those assets in this. And I was redoing animations. So what you're actually going to see is animations I took out of World of Warcraft and I fixed. So Blizzard doesn't know anything about animation, really. They just hire whoever the fuck. There is so much clipping and stretching and noodly and things bending in completely insane and unrealistic ways. I went out on a quest to fix all that for the animations, but I couldn't make new animations. I wasn't an animator. I was just a guy who had spent some time in 3ds Max slamming his face into walls until the walls broke. And there was limits for that for this project. So those 3 years from then until now were not, like, the time that was spent building was not spent building. It was spent researching and trying to learn. So I have pretty severe learning disabilities. What you're going to see is a product of an actual autist. Not like a Reddit autist, but an actual autist who really struggles understanding basic concepts. And I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for HKS. HKS had been dealing with Unreal and learning programming and stuff like that prior to me getting into it. He handles the low-level stuff in it. He has given me hardware, assets, stuff like that for this. He's on call when I have issues with something. I'll, consult him for help. There's lots of things I run into that he doesn't have experience with, but definitely owing a lot of the programmatic stuff to him, especially. And one of the things I'm going to be demoing is something we were working on last night and yesterday, actually, which is figuring out testing for dashes for AI so that they will avoid falling off of cliffs, the things that Dark Souls does. So that's one.
Dude, I'm gonna be honest. The most burned into my brain memory of Dark Souls is probably the zombie. I think it's in one of your it's like the very first game probably, and there's a zombie that just does an attack swing at you, and then in the middle of that just falls off. It's just. When I played Dark Souls 3, this also happened where a wolf did a lunge at me, killed me, and then fell off the cliff. So
yeah. Okay,
so shit like that is everywhere.
If you want me, I can jump right into this right now, and we can just go from there. So let me just Again, a lot of disclaimers here. This is not going to be a very high quality image. So we're showing what is a demo map. And the demo map I have constructed explicitly for this cast. However, I am hoping anybody who's familiar with my real life knows that everything right now is extremely tenuous. We just avoided a bullet. I am hoping that in December I can actually have something playable, and then Pernogo can go through that on his own. And then you'll have a higher quality recording, or at the very least, I will produce a small demonstration in my standard encoding settings. So this should hopefully work.
It's spinning. Oh, shit.
Are we live?
Yeah, hold on. I got to click some buttons. All right. It looks like we are good. It's going to be the wrong aspect ratio because I'm at 1080 and you're at 1200.
Okay. Let me change the window.
Oh, there you go.
Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay.
We're good.
So we may as well start from the start. Why an action RPG?
And why are there 3 crows?
Why are there 3 crows? That's a really good question. There are 3 crows, actually. So there's definitely a lot of things to talk about, a lot of things to get into this. I may as well just try to jump from the start. Anything you want to comment on or ask about or whatever, just feel free to jump right in.
All right.
So this is Unreal 5. The project started, of course, in Unreal 4. I have worked with Unreal 4, again, on and off since Unreal 4 was still actually a subscription. And most of my experiments at the time were fishing around for character concepts for those earlier Apexes that I talked about as hypotheticals. I did a lot of probing to try to figure out how I could get ports from games like Terra, Lineage 2, World of Warcraft, any of these games I knew how to take graphics from, put into like Warcraft 3 or StarCraft 2 or whatever. I wanted to get them into Unreal, and I wanted to learn how to get them to work. Because, even at that time, I had been working with modeling for 15, 16, 17 years. I didn't know the first thing about organics. I was never going to be a character artist. The absolute most I could ever ask of myself was doing what I was doing for Armageddon Onslaught 2, which was taking these assets out of these games and changing their proportions and stuff like that. And that is a long story, and honestly, probably even outside the scope of this cast, if it's judging by the length we're already going at. So, Believe me, to get to this point, this was a long road. No decision was made lightly. Nothing we're doing was done lightly. So, this is Unreal 5. That means we're running Lumen. We're running Nanite. These systems are not production ready, not performant. I know I'm going to get 1 billion and 1 messages from certain individuals if they see this video and they see it performing terribly, and they're going to be like, oh my god, the performance is so bad. Why would you do this? I'm using Lumen to avoid reflection captures, to avoid light baking, light maps, all this other shit. If you don't know what those are, don't worry about it. We have dynamic global illumination based on distance fields. There's ghosting. And if you know, like even right now on the ground, there's DFAO that you can't turn off with Lumen currently. It ghosts. I know it looks like shit. Don't worry about it. I'm well aware of everything. So, however, some things we're not running, for those of you who are familiar with this, we do not run temporal anti-aliasing. It looks like shit. It's shit. It's bad. It's terrible.
I was going to comment on that too, because that's something that you'll be delighted to know that in that Star Wars game, in order to turn off motion blur, you needed to use a cheat code.
Yeah, well, I mean, at least you could. In a lot of games like DMC5, it's fucking hard-coded into the EXE and the DLLs. You can't turn off this crap. Temporal anti-aliasing is just a blur filter. It makes everything look like shit. But there are more and more and more and more things that are requiring temporal anti-aliasing to try to shore up their weak spots. So one of the most major issues that we have is this. Right now, you may not see it very well. In fact, I can pause it. Okay, I can't pause it apparently. Maybe not in this. The hair has this dithering kind of effect going on. So I had HKS test this in a newer version. I'm in version 5.0 off of a development branch. 5.1, which is supposed to be a very major version up, almost as much as 4 to 5. Apparently does not produce this issue. It fixes a lot of the performance issues we're going to see in this. It makes Nanite call stuff properly. Luma's going to perform better. Basically, don't worry about the performance. Don't worry about it. Obviously, work in progress. Nothing you see is even really, like, this isn't really ready to show, but I'm showing it because shit's really serious in my life, and I don't know if it'll ever be in a state better to show. So anyways, it's an action RPG. If you're familiar with whatever Pernogo was playing, the Star Wars game, it'll look very familiar to you. If you're familiar with Dark Souls, DMC, you might think of this ideologically as a hybrid of the two. That means that there's navigation in this, there's double jumping, it's more of an arcade game than Dark Souls. But we do some things very differently. One of the most major things that we do very differently than every other one of these games, we don't use lock-on. There's no lock-on. This is not a console port. It will not support controllers at all. There's no lock-on. That means to attack, to navigate, you actually have to use your keyboard and mouse, just like you would on a PC game. So you can forego all the super awkward camera management, the weird issues with Dark Souls has where the lock-on will drop if a little pole goes in front of your screen, and all the other really awful necessities associated with that. That also means this is going to be a lot harder to actually play. So
yeah, well, I played through the entire Jedi game without lock-on because it's just like, it's almost a principled thing, but I also just keep forgetting to use it. Yeah. There's like tutorial sequences where they teach you how to use it, and it just never felt natural. But it also did say, even though you can play with the mouse and keyboard, a controller is really where the best experience of that was. Yeah. I just want to slap people who write those kind of messages upside the head. Like, what's wrong with you? This is a PC game, right? So
some of these games you can do that. Like, I believe, again, Darksiders, I believe. I went through pretty much all of Demon Souls without lock-on using a spear until at the very end of the game when I was struggling with pure Black Boletaria 3. I tried lock-on the Knights and I realized you can just backpedal at full speed and it just breaks the entire fucking game. Yeah. And I realized, wow, these games were never actually designed for lock-on. And I used it and I just breezed through the rest of it. So, but right from the get-go, we're not using that in this. So, I'm an individual who considers the Souls games very easy. They are very easy games, honestly. They're very trivial. For the reasons I just mentioned, there's no AI. Dark Souls 3 is a QTE cycle simulator. You do the QTE or you get spanked, and that's kind of it. And everything is based on like rotations to the point that if they do something in a certain order, somebody blindfolded can kill Pontiff Sullivan. So I've seen all the speedruns and stuff like that. I've seen the speedruns of Bloodborne and stuff like that. Fundamentally, these games are very easy because they're very fundamentally very simple. They're not based on AI. They're based on quick time events. And the second that you start to take off limiters and stuff like that, it really imbalances a lot of how they're designed because of stamina systems. So the other thing about Dark Souls is basically a turn-based game. It's not really real time because of the way the stamina, the rolling, and the animations and stuff work. Just like MMOs like World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy XIV, those are all turn-based because of the global cooldown. That's a lot. That is in large part how a lot of Souls and Souls-like games work, where you're given iframes. And this even goes all the way back to the fighting games and beat-em-ups and stuff like that they kind of derive from, where certain moves or certain actions give you iframes. So there's a lot of fundamentals with the way I approach my design with the action RPG, and that is, I don't want any of this dumb shit. I don't want lock-on. I don't want iframes. I want your enemies to think, and I want you to have to think to navigate. So immediately, what I wanted, I like some stuff from Dark Souls in the sense that I feel like the Dark Souls was tweaked a lot. It could become kind of a technical fighter. It could be kind of interesting. Unfortunately, because it is a QTE simulator and the way the roles work the way they do, it guts a lot of the potential of that game out. But I really liked some of the ideas. So one thing you'll notice is that we do actually have some weather going on here. So aesthetic is a really big thing with this, and definitely outside the scope of this particular cast. But the weather is just something very recently I've gotten into. So nothing too extreme about that here. But anyways, it's an action RPG. It's more DMC in the sense that you actually have movesets. I didn't really want to get heavy into combo systems like your average fighting game because I didn't really feel like they added a lot. The other thing we're not doing that Dark Souls does is weapon damage types. So there are damage types in this. Now, when I attack, you'll see, just like in Dark Souls, your health bar shows up. We've got, this is, of course, placeholder, but you've got 10 health, 20 stamina. Technically, it's 10 stamina. The stamina has nothing to do with you running, jumping, attacking. That stamina is for stagger. Think of it as like poise from Dark Souls if it was actually a health bar. When you are at half, aka 10, you can be stunned by anything that deals stagger damage. There are things in the game world that deal health damage and no stagger damage, and stagger damage and no health damage. So it's up to you to figure out what those are. In other words, try not to get hit because they're dangerous in different ways. Enemies follow the same logic as well. They'll have different values, of course, but that's the same idea. Beyond that, the only other damage type is a damage type that deals health damage when you have no stagger. It's called stagger conversion damage. Some things in the game world, particularly environmental effects, will deal only stagger damage until your stagger is drained, and then they will start dealing health damage. There is nothing like the Estus Flask in this world. I'll talk a little bit about progression later on, since Pornogo did ask about map travel. That's a very important thing to ask about, and I feel like it's worth bringing up and discussing how I plan to address some things like that, because that's a very volatile thing. So anyways, without lock-on, this gameplay is a little bit more like the old Jedi Knight games, actually. And that is... that attack doesn't do any damage currently, don't know that. You actually have to aim things to hit with it. And hopefully it's not too dark because of the overcast and the weather. There is certain special mix-ups currently. Some deal more damage, some deal more stagger damage, and the collision is pretty generous right now. That's the other thing I kind of want to give you a disclaimer on is the collision might be really wonky because it's using overlaps. I need to transition it to a trace-based system. We're probably going to use RAM as plugin for that, but I'm going to wait for it to go on sale. So the other thing that you probably ran into a lot within your Star Wars game is gimmicks. Special needs interactions to do special needs stuff. So maybe like specific prompts or specific kinds of behaviors or something you got to do for this one specific spot. The wall climbing is a really big one. And for this, it's really just going to be more like Doom. You just attack things or walk over them and shit happens. If I have any special interactions, it'll really just be the interact prompt. Navigation. We have mantling. I'm using ALS. I've gutted a lot out of it. We have mantling and then double jumping, and that's kind of it. And that's probably...
It looks, upon first glance, it looks like the mantling is a lot slower than just double jumping to begin with.
Yes.
So that could be dangerous for combat, obviously.
So, yeah.
Just like an easy observation.
So, yeah, it's nice to have. It's something that should be fairly low-key, but it's something that you can make use of throughout the world. So the other thing that I want to kind of establish is that I approach level design a lot differently than everybody else does in this entire industry. And... when I looked at Dark Souls, specifically Dark Souls 1, and you have that big castle where Undead Burg is at, and you can only go to like a tiny fraction of that castle.
Yeah.
I always felt that was kind of shitty, because you have a game setting that could have been interested if you were interested in telling a story. Well, From Software doesn't tell stories. They don't really get into that. But you could at least have environmental storytelling if you could actually explore the castle and see it in its entirety. You can't do that. There's two kinds of arms to this. One, I want something that's very action-oriented like DMC. Two, I like the exploration elements within Dark Souls when they're actually exploration and not just a quarter like most of the game.
Oh, you know what's really funny about the Dark Souls exploration method is that so many people have told me that one of the things that they really like about Dark Souls is that when you see something, you can go to that thing and eventually walk on it or whatever. And that's where, like, oh, there's this enormous tower, and you can eventually go there. And for one, I think that's brilliant. But for another, they kind of overlook the same thing that you just said, which is, yeah, you can go there, but it's like you can go to maybe like a fraction of what you can see in it. So is it really that you can go anywhere you see? Obviously not. It's that you can go to, like, you know, a tiny fraction of what you can see, because like there's all these like closed off corridors or doors or whatever. So that's similar to what you were talking about. I think if you design the architecture such that you have a ton of like things in the distance that you can see that could be really interesting, and sort of like giving you these signposts or landmark values that can tell you what's going on and what's coming up. But definitely the idea, like my idea for 3D level design too, would be something like along the lines of what I think you're getting at, which is if you see something, you can manage to jump on it somehow, or like, navigate it, or go inside a door that you see, or whatever. Is that roughly speaking what you're talking about?
Yeah. So I don't like having invisible walls, doors that go to nowhere, geometry that you just can't climb on when you can climb on others. The main reason why I have the mantling system is so that I can get away from having ladders. I'm probably not going to have ladders just because it introduces another kind of movement system that now the AI has to deal with. And ladder griefing in Dark Souls is very funny, but it doesn't really add too much in the game. So that's something we don't really want to have. So I'm trying to get away from that. Obviously, special abilities and stuff like that, I have to think any of them through, and we're not really at that stage where I can do that yet. I've been really focused a lot on getting in the core stuff working fundamentally. So if you're not really familiar with this kind of process, everything I've just shown you, from the combat system to the hit detection to what I'm going to be showing you in just a moment here, pretty much all that's built from scratch. This isn't like StarCraft 2 where you walk in and you have a trigger system that says, do this and then apply damage to them and then this damage and the health. You have to build everything from scratch, including how health is handled, how the damage is handled, the whole stagger system, the death system, the crow statues getting knocked over and stuff like that. That's all stuff I've built. So while I've had somebody to call upon to help me figure out more advanced stuff, just about all of this, from other than a few things like some like the grass system and the weather system, are using something third party that I've integrated. Even the integration process is still involved. And I have the frameworks here for our item pickup system that's going to be just like in Doom or whatever, where you pick up stuff, and these will be used for the memory sequences for unlocking abilities or whatever. We have a basic door system here, color-coded. This was based off a tutorial, but I added a whole ton of functionality to it. That's the thing. A lot of these tutorials that are out there are absolutely terrible. Even for somebody without learning disabilities, they don't usually give you the hows and the whys they do something. And again, when you're working with something like this, it's just like when you guys are making Antikythera. There are 100 different ways to do any single thing. But amidst those 100 ways, there's only a handful that are actually a good idea, and maybe like 2 or 3 that are actually performance and effective. And you got to figure those out, and most people aren't going to tell you that because they don't know them themselves. So there's just 1,001 different things that I just basically just flew on bareback. Very little hand-holding, just tried to hammer my way through. So very, very recently, because of the length and the size of my maps, I decided I was going to add health restorers. That will be these statues that you'll interact with. They are one use. They will probably be locked behind stuff. They will be guarded by stuff. They will be difficult to get to. There are save points. No checkpoints will be done in this. These will function a little bit like bonfires, except they save your current health and the current state of the map. Those save mechanics are not currently in here, and I don't know if they'll be in December when I'm hoping to have this in your hands. But the teleportation aspect of them do work. The save system in itself, the per unit and saving the map state, that's something a little more advanced that I haven't even tried to get into yet because I've been focused on more critical stuff. But those are some of the map elements. To gain access to save points, to gain access to those health restore statues, which, by the way, will not restore if you use them and then use a save point, they're done. You have to figure that out into your map clearing strategy. Those things are going to require you to plan ahead and to clear to and to discover. That's where some of the discovery aspect is going to come from. The very process of interacting with the world and finding elements in the world is something that's going to be wrought with danger, because this is more like Dark Souls in the sense there's no forced arenas except for boss fights. They will have their own checkpoint, own save point. There is a difference, and I commonly mix those two terms up. But you can expect a difficulty. Like, when I think about mechanics, this is slower than DMC on Turbo. I would like to speed it up a little bit. I'm waiting for our revamped collision test to really try to do that. But I would like to challenge players who are at a very high level of skill within DMC, like Schnee or Blowhard or a certain drunken Swedishman that I talked to. People who have well beyond made the game's most difficult fights trivial. People who basically, what they do is they make these combo videos and they perfect these technical arts. You could think of them as like the J-Dong of DMC, except without the competitive aspect. It's really just to show off. And it's really, this is an elaborate subject, by the way. This is something I wanted to talk about in a discussion a while back that I believe I may have actually released at some point a while ago, in that it's almost masturbatory in a sense, where it's a show of power, particularly since DMC3 had a higher skill barrier to it than pretty much every other game of its type within that generation and every generation to come afterwards. When you overcome that challenge, that's an expression of power. And then to become technically proficient in, to do stuff like jump cancel and hold enemies that are devil triggered in the air for like a minute at a time or whatever, that's an extra show of power that's further improved by the road that it took you to get here. The journey was a part of the reward. That's what I want with this. At the entry level, I want the entry level for this to be maybe not necessarily requiring you to be jump canceling shit or whatever back and forth, but to require a degree of precision and map awareness and decision making and technical fundamentals that none of these games even attempt to get into. And that's certainly a very tall task when you're using predominantly third-party assets like the animations in this case, and like a lot of the models. But I believe it's something that can be accomplished through a combination of intelligent audio design, not just making audio cues readable and audible, but also avoiding the dynamics, loudness war stuff that's kind of crept up in games in the last few years, where the very nature that acoustics and stuff has done is very weird, where sounds are super quiet until you're right up to them and then they're hyper loud. That's the kind of stuff we're avoiding. We're looking more like at an arcade kind of thing. But down to the very way that the map layouts are going to be done is something I want you to have to think about. In the sense that most of these games, including like Dark Souls 3, I haven't played Elden Ring, so I can't really comment extensively on that, but I don't think it's any different from what I've seen. You clear up to a bonfire, you get to the bonfire, that's it, there's your checkpoint. And then you can go on to dying for the next hour and a half or whatever in the Legend and Orlando or something. But with this, I want the very process of knowing when to use the save point, how to get to the save point and stuff like that to be its own part of the progression and not something that's absent. I want every single map element, including finding the keys to these doors or opening doors, or if you even want to open the door, maybe you're at a skill level you don't care about these health restores or save points or anything else. You just want to clear up to get to the boss or something. Maybe you're trying to do a speed run. It's all about having decisions and stuff like that. And then just what I was saying with our level design, we don't want to have the world sectioned off intentionally, unnecessarily. So you can jump anywhere. I mean, this is a demo map, but this is going to be the same thing for my maps too. If there's walls and rooftops and places that look like you should be able to get there, in all likelihood, you can get there. And then along the way, we're going to have an AI that supports that. And one of the first things I got into with this was an AI that supports that. Now, in this, I'm just going to go through this very briefly. Like I said before, there's a road to reach this point of experimenting with character assets, of retribution and the tech demo assets I was putting into here because I was going to do a tech document where I went through all the ships and all the characters and stuff like that. And some of those got integrated into here, and I modernized them and brought them into here. Most people will probably recognize the Emperor, for example. And there's like this model that someone gave me, I think it was on the Mapster IRC some years ago, that I tossed into here, and that was like for a phone game. There's these sprite sheets, and we do have a little bit of streaming issues, probably because the streaming pool's not liking this area. I gave you these actually very recently to use these in your projects. Those are from way back. I created them with FumeFX. Some of them have been extensively edited after the fact. and brought into Retribution and then used within StarCraft 2, and well, that didn't go anywhere. I actually offered and made assets for Antioch Chronicles 3, and they didn't even want to use custom particles, so they never used them. And that's where this one, I think this one and maybe another one comes from. They're now being used in this, and we're going to actually see them. I created these assets here originally. We do have some streaming issues. This is very possibly because of my system GPU, actually. Yeah, that's one of the problems with Play an Editor in particular, and launching out of the editor is it's just terrible on streaming stuff.
Yeah.
These were all originally made for Sins of a Empire. Why I'm showing these is just to give an example of what I was able to do with pretty much minimal effort walking into this. And again, these were ship models I made for Retribution. And then the character assets that I was working with in my early experiments, the Terra assets, the Lineage 2 assets, the old Worgen, and then the new one, the weapons I updated. All of these are ports from stuff that is like a decade old or older prior to when I put them into here. And we are seeing a lot of streaming issues, probably because of this area having these meshes in them. And one of my first particle effects, decals I made, stuff I made for D&D or edited. And this here is the very first material I made for Unreal 4, way back. And what it does is it takes the texture information, like the diffuse, the normals, and whatever else you feed it, and it uses that to mask into higher resolution textures. And I did this exclusively to take old assets and modernize them, trying to make them look higher resolution. When you are not an artist, you just kind of try to do whatever you can get your damn hands on. Kind of like you and the sprites for Cosmonaut and Brood War. It's just, if you can get your hands on it, you try to bend it to your will. And that's...
and most people who are just watching will probably be surprised if they would be shocked, perhaps, to know how much... well, in the case of it being as part of a released product that you're charging money for, I think it's fair to call it asset theft. But that kind of stuff happens all the time in big games. You'll see the same, like if you, and hopefully, oh, perfect. I love this. Hopefully it's the same thing basically as like, you know, the audio is more noticeable perhaps, and hopefully they've edited the asset, whatever it is. But there's a lot of theft that goes on. You'll find the same stuff ripped from other games, like similar to our mindset, probably because somebody was like, I need 25 models by the end of this week. And then poor intern was just, what do I do? Let me grab some shit from this game.
Well, this project is private. It will never be made public. I'm not looking to sell it. You can try to DMCA me. Good luck. It doesn't exist anywhere on the internet. You can't DMCA something that isn't accessible. So, but I mean, it is something I'm still conscious about. I'm conscious about because what I'm about to get into is going to really get to what it's conscious about. We're using a World of Warcraft asset for the player character, and there's a variety of reasons why. The first reason is it's something I'm familiar with because I was working with the old one back in Armageddon Onslaught 2. I understand the bone structure and the topology to an extent. I was able to fix a lot of proportions with it. 2, it fits the character persona that I was after. And 3, the reasons I'm about to get into. This is where you're probably going to see me get angry. So this is the first edition of the model. This was when I started back in 2019. So these are actually all Blizzard animations. I believe at least half of them, but probably more. I have gone into 3ds and I have retooled frame by frame, bone by bone. So we have the running animation here looks absolutely nothing like the original. Because the original running animation with the weapons that just flailed around all over the place. I made it actually look like you were carrying weapons. The landing in combat animation, the weapons and everything would just sink through the ground. That was fixed. These swing animations, the arms would fold, clip through the chest, everything would stretch all over the place. That's all been fixed up. These have probably 20, 30 hours worth of work put into them because, again, I wasn't working with a rig. And I ran into countless issues exporting the assets back into Unreal. And that's what led me down the Blender arc. is that I was using 3ds Max 2011, and exporting FBXs out of Unreal was problematic as it was, but getting them the FBX version in 3ds Max or the exporter, something was wrong where it was fucking up the smoothing and stuff on the models. So normally what you would do is you would not use a third-party asset that's from a commercial CD that Blizzard found in their basement like 20 years ago. You would try to use something that's newer, and you have a marketplace, so you would try to do that. And so that was our mindset for 2 years or so. And we ran into so many issues that we're now going to get into. I'm sure I've talked to them about some extent within Big Boy's Table, but I've never shown you them. Now I'm going to show you them.
Here we go.
Here we go. So here we have an asset that is currently available on the Unreal Marketplace. And the asset says it's for the mannequin skeleton. I want you to pay attention to the legs. The mannequin is the official mannequin, and the legs on the other one do not. Oh, they clip right through the leg. What? But it should be. It says it's right through the legs. Oh. You see, when I was at the end of 2019, going into 2020. Jesus Christ. 2020.
Classic.
We had the issue where I couldn't make animations, but there was all these animations on the marketplace. Why not just use those? Well, the working is a different skeleton, a completely different skeleton than the mannequin. The mannequin is a standardized skeleton that Epic has with their editor. And this skeleton, you can release animations for it. And when you release character assets on the marketplace, you have to say, is this on the mannequin skeleton or not? Because the idea is that you can acquire animations on the marketplace that say they're for the mannequin, and you can apply them to any character that is also on the mannequin. It's a very simple system, and it works when people actually follow the fucking rules. The problem is that those rules are not actually enforced in any shape or fashion. And the other problem that other people would probably say is that, well, the mannequin's proportions don't exactly fit that of a female character. And they don't even fit that of a lot of the male characters either. You'll have this exact same problem with male characters. We're just using female characters as an example because our player character is going to be female. But this is the same issue of running with male characters all over the place as well. In fact, I have the Paragon assets I would like to use, but we're going to have issues with those. Just the same as this, and I have. The problem is that people will say their assets are on the mannequin skeleton, and they're not. We have people who will make a tutorial that say, here's how you make a model for the mannequin skeleton. And the first thing they do is move bones around. Now, the thing is that may not be terribly obvious to a lot of people who don't deal with this stuff is that bones and animations are very precise math. If anything on the bones is off, even by a tiny amount, it fucks everything. It fucks everything. You get the legs going through each other like this. Now, there are much worse examples. So this is a simple animation. Let's just focus on the center one right now. The center one is they re-skinned mannequin, but still just a mannequin made by Frank Climax, a individual who makes fairly reasonable animations on the Unreal Marketplace. He uses a two-handed animation with a katana, very simple. And the feet stay on the ground, and he's otherwise employed pretty reasonable practices here. This is a root motion animation, it's just not on. So the other thing that's really fucked up about this whole situation is the retargeting system. So what retargeting is in concept is you take animations from one skeleton and put them on another. It's supposed to be able to translate the data from one set of bones to a set of bones that would be in different proportions but have the same general hierarchy. Epic has advertised retargeting as the solution to problems like those I just talked about when it isn't. It isn't. And this is why. When you retarget something with different proportions, you end up with all kinds of fucked shits. Now, just pay attention to the hands. Well, the other character is not holding a sword. but you will see the differences very clearly just within this animation. Although look at her hands, even with the sleeves covering them, you'll actually see they're completely, the offhand is like too far forward, too far across. And the main hand will also be different because the bone lengths are different. The most destructive thing you can do is change the lengths of the bones. If they're in a different orientation, you can fix that with a rest pose change. In fact, you can kind of fix the legs on the other one by doing that, but you cannot fix the arms. You can't. You get fucked shit. And I could go on and 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 on for hours about this. On and on and on. Look at the feet. So the other problem is that every person who releases a female character asset has to give them high heels. And they won't release it with a version that doesn't have high heels. For example, there's a version of this asset that has no shoes, no high heels. The fuck are they called? I don't know. The kind of shoes. But they're still on a skeleton for high heels. That totally changes the orientation and the distance of the bones. Now, in this example, I have changed that in the rest pose. But what you're going to see is that information is still different. Even though you've changed the positions back, that data is still different than the mannequin you're retargeting from. So now the feet are sliding all over the place and going in and out of the ground. Now, you might think just use IK to fix that. You need a different IK offset for every different thing to try to compensate for that. All this bullshit would be avoided if people just fucking use the mannequin skeleton, or just say, hey, it's not on the mannequin skeleton, or hey, I've changed the lengths of bones and stuff around. The thing is at the very least, it makes a lot of work for people. By the way, these particular assets I'm showing off, not Frank's, but the Kitsune and the other one, they don't even have twist bones weighted, which is necessary for corrective bones. So I'm going to skip forward 3 years. Well, more like 2.5 years. I took the Wargame and I manually weight painted the fucking thing onto the mannequin in Blender. And that took me close to a month to do. The reason why I did that is because the Worgen was the closest to the mannequin proportionally. And I knew how to remodel the legs. I've remodeled the legs from the old asset. You see, we went from plantigrade or whatever it was called back to normal, or I forget what the names are. You know what I'm talking about. And then I weight painted everything, including the twist bones and shit like that. And of course, I've tried to use different assets for the hair and the tail or whatever. Let's ignore those. That's a terrible mess, and I have no idea what I'm doing. I despise Blender with every fiber of my being. Every fiber of my being. But if I found another asset that worked better than this, was more modernized and at the same proportions and fit everything, I would do it again just to get out of having to use this asset. But the fact is that I still spent a month and I figured out, and that's why we're here, because that was the only solution that would hand me a model that, as you can see, the difference is because they're not precisely in the same spot. The Frank mannequin is just a skeletal mesh. This player character is an actual player character. Their offsets are slightly different. But in spite of that, if you watch the feet and the hands and the stuff like that, you're going to see that they're basically, it's the same skeleton. It's from Mr. Mannequin's tools in Blender. It's the same skeleton. I can appoint animations to this without retargeting at all, because you shouldn't need to use retargeting, because retargeting really doesn't work. Unreal 5 comes with something called an IK retargeter. That doesn't fix any of the problems I just ran into, because the bone lengths are still different.
It sounds like to me that the same way that I complain about all different stuff being wrong in 2D games, it's like there's way more shit that that you can get wrong basically in 3D. And so
the fucked animation, the walking animation, that's their own thing that they retargeted that they show in their fucking video. That they say, hey, look, we support the mannequin. The legs are clipping through each other. And that's an easy one to fix. You can change the rest pose, you probably fix that. But the other ones you can't just fix. And it's like right in front of you. And the twist bones is actually more insane. Because the part of the problem is that the people releasing these assets, they don't use Unreal. They came out of college or whatever. They make these assets. They sell them. They're trying to make a living. They push them onto Unity. They push them onto Unreal, or they sell the straight FBXs. Usually a combination of the above. They don't know anything about Unreal. They have to usually have someone come in to help them to make the most basic of the materials for their stuff, or to try to implement something. A lot of these people don't even know to turn off the motion blur and temporal anti-aliasing and not use the editor viewport to take example screenshots of their shit. They use something like Marmoset Toolbag to make their fucking marketing material for a game asset as opposed to the game engine itself. There's a lot of people who are like that. They don't know that retargeting is fucked because they don't spend the time to get into retargeting. And Epic has said, look, retargeting saves all your problems. Go ahead and change the proportions. They don't know any better because that's the fucking information they were handed. Why would they believe otherwise unless they spend however much time dealing with it when they don't want to deal with it? They're just trying to sell an asset. So I can only blame them so much, but I still blame them because open your fucking eyes. Seriously, like, this is everywhere across the marketplace. You're going to see this with everything. And you always expect to go through some amount of work when you're bringing in third-party content into your project. You're going to make changes. That's the whole point, is to set yourself up with a base asset that you can work with. The problem is you have to do all kinds of, like, bringing the asset into Blender and weight painting the twist bones. That's just, and then having to, what you would have to do for those animations, by the way, like the katana, to get it to be even remotely put in the hand. You have to use the key. There's a keyframing function within Unreal. You have to keyframe every single related bone in the hands for every single animation just to get it lined up. Just use the mannequin skeleton, and then you don't have those problems. The only animations on this asset I have had to do anything like that is these ones right here, because that author uses a different orientation on an IK bone. I just about got gassed, and I'm going to show you those in a minute. Yes, we're going to get into juicy stuff instead of just ranting. But I had to adjust the orientation of the bone that I attached it to because it wasn't the same. It's a very minor thing. Very minor thing. But having to go through all the effort of trying to hand fix and readjust every single animation for something because you couldn't be asked to tell people you changed the lengths of the arms and legs or whatever. That's just... It's just gosh darn silly. It makes you a goofball. Goofball. It makes you a damn goof. Okay, so we're gonna jump right into juicy shit now. So I've got some aggressive weeds here, and they're shooting jizz at me. And these are projectiles. Now, in most of these games, you can't do too much. In this, you can actually destroy projectiles. Any attack you have can destroy projectiles. Oh, I'm gonna die. So this is what happens in this. You could think of it as like Dark Souls. There's no safety nets. Even in the testing maps, I don't have safety nets. Because the whole point is that you got to pay attention to what's going on. If I'm talking and then trying to demo something and I'm going to die for it, that to me is a good thing. That's the entire point that I go through with my testing process and a lot of this stuff. I hope this doesn't take a long time to load, but it might. Is that if you're in a situation where you stand to benefit from exposure to an experience, then you should have that experience there. And when I initially designed this, I wasn't going to have save points other than at the start of the zone and at the start of a boss fight. I wasn't going to have any health restorers whatsoever. And the whole point was to avoid having to deal with that. But then I decided to have larger levels. And that was mostly as an experience that I came through by building a large level and going through it. There's a lot of established conventions, like having stun mechanics and stuff like that I'm following. I may be doing my own turn of them, but I'm following them to some extent. But I vet my stuff in my own way to make those decisions and to implement them, so that I understand from my own perspective how and why they are there and what they actually contribute to the game. So projectiles and range and stuff like that, in a lock-on system, you wouldn't really do things like this. But in this, even though the player's collision for the weapon is quite gratuitous right now, actually hitting those projectiles, that takes some precision. And some attacks are better at it than others from certain angles. Any attack can kill it. And honestly, probably most of the projectiles in the game I'm going to let you destroy, except for ones that really obvious you shouldn't be able to destroy. Because that really hasn't been done before. The closest you get is near Automata, and that game's a joke, and all the projectile stuff in that's just a gimmick. In this, it's just something that felt to be a natural interaction, because you have a supernatural weapon that's literally like a living god unto itself. Why wouldn't it be able to cut shit out of the air? So this is our most basic ranged enemy, and they're not really ready to show. There's using something called EQS, which is experimental and really derpy. But I'm going to show you them today because they do something that you kind of just sort of expect to see. So first of all, they're going to try to attack me, and after they attack me, he's actually going to jump over that ledge. That's something you never see in modern video games. And they're going to wait until an amount of time passes, generally close to when they have their cooldowns up and they're ready to fire again. And then they're going to try to find me. And then they're going to try to attack me. And
something I noticed right out the gate, actually, was that there was a guy who was pretty far away just animating, and then he caught you and started attacking, which is, like, that seems really subtle to people, I think, but it's actually really important that when you have line of sight on somebody, you might move to attack, especially if you have a ranged attack as the player, but you never expect an actual AI to do that or like an enemy to do that. I also just noticed there's a bit of friendly fire there. I don't know if they can take damage from their own stuff.
Yes, actually they can. Some things will not be able to deal friendly fire. Some can. Their projectiles can actually also hit each other. So
oh, okay. Interesting.
You can manipulate that, obviously, if you're pursuing them and running around, there's a lot of projectiles following you. You probably want them to hit a wall, or you want to cancel them, like I'm doing right now. Or you can try to get the projectiles to ram into each other. So most of the time in most games, homing projectiles are just very silly because you can't really interact with them. Whereas in this, the fact they're homing lends to more of a characteristic because of the way you can interact with them. And that is a really major distinction in that the way you're interacting with stuff completely changes the way in which you approach certain things. To be fair, when I first entered this, way back, I never imagined having a homing projectile. I didn't think I would ever really want to have a homing projectile. But then I started thinking about how will you interact with projectiles in general, and I thought, well, you should just be able to hit projectiles. Originally, I was just going to have a special move that you use to hit projectiles. And that never got added because, for one, I wasn't even sure how projectiles worked at the time. And then they're just very simple to work with. And once I got into them, I worked on the bomb, which I will show momentarily. And I let you attack it, and then through the process, it made every other thing attackable. And I just left him that way and just never used a special move for it. And it just felt natural. Just your regular movement set interacts with the projectiles. Not a special ability, not a special prompt. It's just, there's something flying towards you, so hit it. Now, some things in here are not hooked up. Their melee attack is not hooked up, so they can't deal damage to me in melee right now. But the logic for these guys is actually very simple. They will try to find vision of you when they know you are there. And that part is a little finicky because the system I'm using to find those locations is very complex and involves math. And I don't understand math, and it's really awkward. But it kind of sort of works. It works better in an actual map. This is actually the worst case scenario. With these ledges here, I've intentionally gone out of my way to make the testing area as awful for their AI as possible, so I can stress test it as much as possible. So the ledges really
it doesn't look like the fog created by their projectiles actually blocks their vision, which is presumably something you might want to look into doing later.
It doesn't block their vision currently. I might do that as possible. They're sort of like sentient psychic plants, so in some cases that might block them or another. So the other thing is that when they attack, they will try to hide. They will try to run from you. They'll find a location that's outside of the player character's line of sight until they're ready to attack again. Now, something that behaves a little bit derpy is sometimes they will run past you. to reach their destinations. So that's something that I'm using something that should have fixed it, but it didn't. So I'm not sure where to go from that point. But this is a very simple enemy. They move around and they attack. It's the dumbest of the dumb in terms of what they do, but how they do it is completely different. You'll also notice when I'm entering the gas cloud, it's shredding my stamina. And this is that special damage type I was talking about, where only after I'm completely down in stamina will it start dealing health damage. So it's something that you can make the tactical decision to engage, to jump through, even though you may not entirely know what's on the other side. I actually have a test recording I made where I went through and there was actually 3 of them on the other side, and they all blasted me in the face the instant I came over. So just like those little interactions, like just the way they behave. That's the thing I've always focused a lot within my projects, is how things behave. When I went into StarCraft 2, I didn't look at what abilities does this unit have. I looked at how does this unit behave. And even when I was talking to you about your project, that was what I said all the time is, don't focus on abilities, focus on things, how they behave, how you interact with them. And when I think about enemies in this, the first thing I think about is, what are they going to behave like? When these weeds, I thought they were my second enemy I created. The first one is the one I'm about to show you. And the weeds I had an enemy that was melee and had some ranged attacks. And now I wanted to make a range-centric enemy. So how would the range-centric enemy behave? Well, it's a range. It's going to try to keep at a range. So now, then you could just make it just constantly move back, but that's not very interesting. You want to have enemies that play the map. The big thing about not having closed-off arenas, like in DMC or God of War, is that you open up massive amounts of terrain that the enemies can try to use. You need the enemies to be able to read the map and play the map. And there's a few different ways you can do it. There's the EQS system that I use for those weeds. Again, it's prototype, experimental. Like, I feel like Unreal gets some unjustified hate from people in this server, but at the same time, there's absolutely a lot of justified hate, and you'll never see me shilling for them. And one of the things I really despise about Epic is the fact they've let the AI languish for so long, and the EQS system, everything related, is in dire need of some modernization, and especially user friendliness. So this is a Void Hound. This is using an asset from Lineage 2. That's Unreal Warfare. That's like Unreal 2. This is a very ancient asset. All the particle effects I have made. So all these particle effects that you're going to be seeing, with the exception of the bomb activation and the impact effects, are ones that I built. I built some of them off of examples from Cascade effects. These were pretty much my very first Niagara effects. So I did those in the course of about a day and a half. And that was to attempt to learn how. So I can see that the stun behavior is still a little awkward. There is going to be some strange bugs, but I haven't actually tested that yet. So these guys are not as dangerous as the weeds in the sense that they don't spray gas everywhere. But you'll notice they are actually very aggressive. And the bombs aren't really finished yet. You can kill those too, by the way. They deal stagger damage if you run into them, and they chain off of each other as well. These guys kind of navigate around. They have a melee. They have a stagger melee. Ranged. We do have leading behavior in for basic ranged attacks, but arcing behavior doesn't work very well yet. So something I'm going to add is that they'll actually detonate those bombs. So the Void Hound was the first enemy I added, and they've seen a lot of work over time as a test bed and stuff like that. This, to me, is my zombie. You enter Undeadburg, and there's the little undead guys that kind of roam around and maybe take a swing at you every now and then. This is my undead guys. And they are infinitely more aggressive, infinitely more active. They do more things. And I'm not done. I am far from being done with them. And it will only go up from here. So the main thing I also want to emphasize with this is not just behavior, but the fact that my enemies are more active, and there's a little bit more to them, and they're not hyper specialized. This is a melee unit, but he has several ranged attacks, and the bombs will do stuff. Right now they just deal stagger damage if you run into it. That's a particle effect I did not make, but I made all the others. So I'm actually quite happy with how those turned out, to be honest. It's Niagara is a pretty complex thing to get into, so it's going to be a little tougher to get into than StarCraft 2 or Sins. But I was pretty content with my first results. So I have 2 more simple things to show you. I think that's the wrong.
Were you looking for fallen void hounds? One of the things I'm curious about is where how they're. It seems like they didn't track you earlier when you were doing as much stuff. As far as like trying to chase you and teleport you, they kind of, like 3 of them went.
Yeah, they weren't. Island. I think there is not really target retention behavior for them right now.
Okay.
They will automatically succeed having retention on you if you're within a certain range, but that is something I need to work a little bit on. So these guys here are very prototype. They are going to have a shield stance in. What I kind of wanted to show at them is the fact that they do kind of different stuff depending on what range you're at, and they're more like your Dark Souls kind of enemy. They're actually probably going to kill me, and we're going to have to force a reload, so I'm going to be a little careful. So actually,
I've seen so far. There's like a lunge, a couple swipes. They have a shield bash, which I imagine deals more stagger.
There was a triple attack that they did very briefly. You might have seen. That's if you're really close to them. And just like compare this to we're gonna have a shield stance where they're more defensive and stuff like that. But I want you to kind of compare this to the Knights and Dark Souls where. They can like 2-shot you, but they mostly kind of sit behind their shields a lot. And the shields on these guys will be something they'll switch into when they're wounded, or when there's more of them, they'll be more defensive and they'll try to maybe blockade you. And,
I was thinking the same thing, is that for when you're dealing with them, when you've actually had them wounded, then maybe they pull back and try to because. I mean, I guess it depends on how. The other thing I was curious about reads-wise is so far I've noticed there's not really a hit marker or anything. It's probably audio, so we're not getting that audio. But there's the idea of introducing how you're gonna know that you've been taking damage or whatever. But if there's a way to take damage and then show visually that you've taken damage. And then also to apply that to all the characters, you can kind of think of this similar to
I died.
Oh, there it is. The Brood War on fire overlays for damaged structures or something. Some way to approximate how wounded somebody is. If you can see that as the player, you could imagine the AI responding to that too. And then if you're both grievously injured, then maybe they take the defensive stance because they just want to see if they can get you a couple more points down or whatever and kill you. That would be a logical thing to do at that point if they have access to that information in a way that it makes sense. It's not just metagaming or whatever.
So to implement that system visually is certainly well outside of my ability at this point. Mostly because I'm not actually sure how to. Let's say, for example, with the Knights in particular, you deal damage to them and then they get bloodied up. The only way I would even conceive how to do that right now is, I guess I could do it through a dynamic material, or maybe if I tried to do it through a decal, I can't, because I have them set to ignore decals so that they don't get decals from the world environment. So I was actually reading up on that recently because I was interested how I might go about doing that. So, there will be impact effects and other stuff like that. I just don't have them set up at the moment. So this guy here, I was hoping to have him a little more finished before we showed him today, but I was trying to hammer out stuff. So what we can actually... I don't have his debug on right now, but this guy is using a system that... There is some twitching. Don't worry, my boy does have autism. And I have to actually probably redo this stuff that I ported in for him. I was trying to figure out how this third-party strafing system worked. And it turns out it kind of works, but it causes that twitching behavior, I think, because of how it does stuff. So there's no damage on him right now, but he's also range sensitive as well. He just will do some basic attacks when you're close. I actually want him to back pedal as well. And
right. Like that.
Yeah. So... he will move back and then try to attack, so he has a higher chance of hitting you. There is some behavior that's unintentional right now, like his attacks will actually follow you, and that again is because of the strafing surface. So actually, what's kind of interesting about this guy is those dashes that he does are the knights, same way. God,
I like the backwards moonwalk on
it. It looks good, yeah, but it works, right? Like, he will detect to make sure he's not going to dash into a cliff, and it doesn't. Like, I'm not 100% sure it completely works yet because it's gone through so many different versions. Right now, it also should be choosing the most ideal range he can get. If there's walls next to him, he will dash up to an extent that he'll actually get some distance out of it. But since I don't have the debugs right now, you won't see it. But that was a system that we built in the last couple of days, and I'm quite happy with it. But as a result, I didn't get a lot of his other stuff done. This is actually going to be the first unit you fight in the game, and he's going to have a lot of shit. He's actually going to be a boss. And my bosses are going to be a lot different than those in Souls in the sense that they're going to be kind of long technical fights, and they're going to be a lot more difficult. So when you think of, like, say, Pontiff Sullivan or perhaps Lord of Cinder, there are 2 phases are equivalent to maybe one of my phases of, say, 3. Or 4 in some cases. So, but the way I do the balancing is going to be different. Like, this guy won't be actually as aggressive early on, but he's going to range more often. And you're going to see a lot of, like, when you see the weeds making smoke clouds and stuff like that, you have to play the map in a very different way than you do in any of these games normally. Suddenly, it becomes a lot more about paying attention to on the map where you gotta go, taking advantage of the fact that the map is wide and open. By the way, I just realized I don't think I can actually get out of here, so I'm just gonna jump off. I haven't really tested this too much.
Yeah.
But the idea is that you play the map as well, and with the weeds really emphasize that. They're my first real example of that, and it actually really surprises me. And I don't know what our time is looking like right now, but I'm going to attempt to load Arvatur.
We got about 30 minutes ish. So.
Okay, I'm going to attempt to load Arvatur. I'm hoping it's going to work, and during that process, you can ask anything you want. But This is obviously just a series of just little concepts that I've taken out of the project at large. What you're not seeing is all the maps. You're not seeing all the internals. This in itself doesn't look like much because we're not seeing the music system I put together a couple days ago. We're not seeing all the performance iterations and other stuff like that I've put into the assets. Not just the assets, but the underlying functionality for these units. Because just like with Antikythera, I have to make the foundations from which things are built upon and make sure they actually work. And there are still little odds and ends to figure out. The stagger system for the enemies and for the player was not properly keeping you locked out of actions for as long as ever since it was ever implemented, because I didn't understand what was going on or what was wrong with it. Only today were we trying to address that finally, because it finally got to the point in the priorities where I could go back and really start trying to figure that out again. And that's just alongside all the other stuff going on in my life that's absolute insanity. So there are certainly a lot of things I wish I could have shown. Like, I wanted to show the ranged attacks on the last guy that I have planned, but I have to figure out how to do that yet. So the learning process for me is very slow. But at the same time, we're taking these out of something that's much larger and much more broadly being developed right now. So what I want to show with that is just those concepts standalone and what they represent. To you, this probably looks a lot different, even just watching it without even playing it. The way that things behave and the way you interact with them probably looks a lot different than any of the other similar titles that you've played so far.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the main thing that I think is a lot of people will compare it to, or maybe should compare it to, and you can comment on whether or not that's true, is probably Dark Souls, because of the fact that it's widespread. People who haven't played DMC or even God of War because they're more older titles, or they only played the most recent God of War, which isn't even the same genre or whatever. And it's like, those people will most likely have played or seen enough about Dark Souls so that they can then say, hey, this is what this is kind of similar to easy to compare. And I guess that's why you were using it as well as like a comparison point for the boss fights and stuff. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that I could say, but I don't know if you wanted to talk about the map that you just finally loaded into with the spastic tail and all.
Yeah, so I didn't actually, that's something I'm going to have to fix, because I've never actually tried this before. It's just flat out zoning into this map through my teleporter script. It didn't put me in the spawn point that I should have spawned in, but feel free to ask anything you want.
Okay, sure, while you make your way over to where you wanted to be. So the main thing that I'm curious about is you mentioned, obviously, like whenever you have a game that is actually skill testing, and I guess like philosophically speaking, I would describe. I don't know if this is a different topic entirely, but there is this idea that maybe streamer culture has brought on the idea that you should actually be like able to multitask while playing a game, and then maybe it should actually be done that way or whatever, which is really silly, but it's like how do games get big these days? A lot of them are done through this idea that, hey, you should be like, if you play the game and you stream the game and you've got a big audience, that's epic and great, and that's how we'll like spread through word of mouth. However, if you can interact with chat, if you can sit there and say like, oh, thanks for 5 gifted or whatever the fuck, like you're gonna be sat there for a while, maybe not playing the game much. And if you have to do that during a pause screen instead of just in the middle of the game because the game doesn't like test your skills or force you to actually be engaged, it's one of those things that to me is like, I don't think you can always pinpoint it exactly on the streaming angle, but it's like similar in that sense to me. It's like maybe there's an element of truth to that hypothesis, and it is just a hypothesis. It's not something that I necessarily believe per se. It's just like, okay, well, clearly there's a trend of games not consuming your whole attention span. What is that trend sourced from? And one of the things that I can see is that like in League of Legends, it's one of like the best games to play while you're just streaming, because there's the times you're dead, there's the times you're walking to lane, there's the loading times, there's all these elements where, and the draft phase and stuff where maybe you don't need to be fully checked in, maybe you can just look at chat. And obviously there's advantages to really watching the game and watching the map and, you know, planning your moves and communicating to your allies and stuff, but that you know, you can ignore that and still perform to a relatively high level and not worry about it basically at all, depending on how you want to do things. So like there's a lot of angles there, but what it seems like you're building, and one of the things that obviously we're trying to build with our RTS games, is the idea that you do need to be fully engrossed in the game in order to find success. And if you don't like make sure that you're basically consistently like taking into account everything, like you were talking about playing the map and having an understanding of the game's like mechanisms and the game state, if you will, with like how the units work, and maybe more stats oriented stuff like how many hits can they take or how long until they can be stunned and stuff. Obviously that's like more nuance or more drilling down specifically. But if you have to keep all of that stuff in your head, there's not really any mental space for you being able to talk to chat or being able to watch something on your second monitor, which is maybe more relatable to people who play games but don't stream or whatever. It's like you can't really multitask with something completely unrelated. Like all of your multitasking skills are being used to take into account aspects of the game the same way that you would do for an RTS, where it's not only like the mechanical stuff you have to keep track of, but also the actual things you're trying to do, trying to remember, like the map state. Where are my opponents? Where is he expanding to? And so on and so forth. So I draw a lot of parallels there in terms of a philosophy. It's really interesting to imagine a 3D action/adventure type game, which this seems to shape up to be, that actually contributes to this idea where you, despite the fact that it's a genre that maybe doesn't have a lot of like full engrossment in its history, it's still really interesting to think about it in the context of, okay, but what if? You know, what if the game was demanding that you do have full focus? And that's probably like as far as large scale, more philosophical concepts go, that's probably the thing that speaks to me the most about what's been shown so far, is like the potential promise of like, if this is taken to its logical conclusion, then you basically have this situation where, I mean, the first thing I thought of when you were introducing the ranged enemy that you're fighting now is, compositionally speaking, it makes really interesting interactions possible where these guys, while you're busy fighting melee guys like you were earlier, these guys can sort of run amok and start laying down a bunch of smoke, and that's obviously dangerous for poise or for stamina rather. And so it's like, what do you deal with that? How do you avoid that? Like, do you try to go for them first while you're getting harassed by the melee guys, or what? Like, how's that working? And then obviously the fact that the maps themselves are more free form, you can do things like jump through the windows, or, you can maybe see them doing that or going through doors or what have you. And
oh my God.
yeah, then they're just all over the place. So yeah, it's really interesting to think about stuff like that in the context of what the game could turn into. But obviously just for what you've demoed right now.
I've got glare on my screen. I can't see shit.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's, I think streamer culture is probably one of the worst things that's happened to games recently. It's, holy fuck. It's, a lot of games are developing for streamers at this point, because streamers are their source of income, and
Well, Apex Legends was basically marketed entirely by streamers because they just paid for a bunch of streams and said, "Hey, all of like the big FPS streamers who play, I don't know, Fortnite or PUBG or CS:GO even or whatever, it's like or Call of Duty and stuff like that. They were just all brought in for at least a day or two so that they could spend their time." Just like marketing the game for them, basically. And the thing is, if it's a game made for streamers, well, most of the people who play the games are not going to be streamers. So what do they do to fill in the time? And now it's just become an expectation based on that, I think, that as a result of the games being made for streamers so that they can stream, or it's made to be streamable, we can say, owned. That means that the game doesn't actually fully engross you. And I guess that's been a trend forever, but it seems to really be like every game now. I can't think of the last game that I played other than, an RTS, I guess, that has demanded full attention or even rewarded me properly, requisite to the amount of focus, and rewarded me for full attention. You know what I mean? So that's probably the main thing that comes to my mind is like, if I actually did have to take into account a 3D map, at least so far as what I've explored in the game so far, and then also take into account the kinds of enemies that I'm facing and what they might do, and how do I get there, and also the landmarks that you were talking about, like the save point and the other stuff. It's like where do I go from there? That's really interesting, just based on it's like makes you have to consider a lot of factors from a strategic standpoint, and then you have to execute on it mechanically, and that union is always something that I'm appreciative of in games anyway, but I think especially for like a 3D game, I just haven't experienced something like that yet, and that's probably one of the most exciting or enticing prospects so far.
So that castle area I was just in, you can explore that entire area. You can go up. Don't think you can quite get onto the roof yet, but you can get up all the floors. And just doing what you're doing now is like unheard of in terms of like just scaling up individual pieces and stuff. Something for locomotion or navigation or whatever you might consider is, and something that occurred to me pretty early on, but I didn't comment on it earlier, is that when you are starting up the mantle, if you still have a jump, like if you only jumped once to get to the mantle point, maybe you could chain that into a jump from the mantle to basically like speed up the process of scaling up stuff, depending on if you're going to have a lot of vertical movement or whatever. That might be like an interesting thing to do. But yeah, it seems like there's a lot of I'll see you later, Crow. There's a lot of opportunities for players to explore the area. And so that's the thing, is that like we talked a lot about the game's mechanics, and we talked a lot about like exploring ideas of how you would build challenging environments and stuff, but there's also just the idea that like maybe it's nice to just explore an area. Maybe it's like compelling that if you see something you can do it. It's like the Dark Souls stuff, but actually truthful, instead of it being like a half measure or whatever. So it's definitely something you need to pay a lot of attention to. When we go into playing the map, my vision for that is actually more like competitive Quake or Halo, where you have to pay attention to respawn timers on armor and weapons. Well, you're not respawning armor and weapons, but you do have to pay attention to where the enemies are, where they can go. Is really one of the big things. Is this with the weeds in particular? It's they kite you in a sense that is totally unlike any conventional kiting, because they try to hide and then they try to find new locations. In that sense, the very interaction of them disengaging you is different, where they will choose locations as opposed to just constantly backpedaling, which means that the way you think about how to engage them changes as well. Now you're doing very different things. Now you have to think about where they could go, how you're going to intercept that.
Yes.
Now it's more like playing an opponent that thinks. Even though they're not thinking, they're still just AI. And no matter how many months, how many years I hammer into the AI, even if EQS gets updated and all this other stuff happens, it's not necessarily going to make such a big difference that it's going to bridge that gap too much more. But if I can give the perception that it is an opponent that is trying to kill you, that it is a threat, and then that it is a threat in game, then that's going to be acceptable for me, because I think that's the most we can really obtain. And I think that that's going to be something absolutely unheard of, especially in this genre. Because we do have fairly intelligent bots within Unreal Tournaments, and I think within Quake, maybe. It's been a long time since I've played Quake. But I know with Unreal Tournament, where they're aware of the map respawns, they do try to navigate them. Now, they kind of just get fed that information, but the way it plays to the player is that superficially, the bots are playing the map, and they are playing the map. They're picking up weapons and armor and stuff like that, and they're navigating around. We are going to encounter some jumpiness in this map, because this foliage just not handled by Nanite, and apparently Lumen really hates foliage right now in this version in particular. So this whole area is navigatable. Actually, underneath of us is a cave that you'll be able to enter. I mean, you can enter right now. There's nothing in there. And this area here is just the beginning framework of what will be a larger structure. And this is going to be considered a small map at the end of the day. And you can't hear it right now, but these guys still make your dog noise.
Perfect.
So these guys are this flesh hunters don't do anything at all.
It seems like a still early.
I put them in mostly to what the fuck? Yeah, see, I actually looked like I should have hit him right there, but nothing happened. That was an overlap. Especially since my frame rate is very low. Please keep in mind, I'm actually running on quite an old GPU that was middle range when it first came out. My performance in this is not really great, and it's absolutely not respective of what a modern system would have. But also, the systems I'm running right now are not performant. There's a lot of stuff I've got to fix. Some of the culling is a little weird. And the level is not really being efficient in general. I mean, look at how many... These are all animated dynamic lights. You couldn't do this before, really, at all in Unreal 4. It would just perform terribly. Well,
I wonder why, and maybe this is maybe this is a performance thing, but I've noticed that you barely ever have multi-shadows on one object in 3D games.
Yeah,
or
that's because
game, really.
Most games, they don't have shadow casting lights. Just like Dark Souls, just like Dumb Eternal, they don't have shadow casting lights. And that is because their games perform like shit. Because they're usually running really bad engines. The Doom Eternal is just terrible, absolutely terrible for performance. And From Software has been using this ancient PlayStation engine that was given to them by Sony, because Sony wanted them to make a competitor. I believe it was to Oblivion or Morrowind. And they gave them this engine, and they've just been using that garbage ever since. And apparently terrible performance follows Souls all the way to modern day with Elden Ring and Denuvo. So, but performance is, there's really a lot of reasons why it's awful. One is Dirtford in general is really bad. But the lights is like, you can only handle 4 dynamic light casters normally on a unit, and I believe it's because of how the shadows are mapped, because there's only 4 channels to go, or 4 colors on the pixel. I can't remember the exact specifics, don't quote me on that. I'm not very familiar with the terminology, but that's the gist that I got of it, and I think that like pure dynamic shadows are just really inefficient. Well, my goal for this project is for literally every single shadow that ever exists to cast or for every single light that exists in the project to cast lights. All those projectiles cast shadows. The Void Hound's projectile, the Weed's projectile, they all cast shadows. Every single light that I just showed you casts shadows. We are looking across a map that probably has some millions of polygons, and my performance is not really too much different than normal. It's a little better over here, but that's just because of Lumen. If I brought up the GPU thing, you'll see that it's Lumen's probe depth or whatever it is, followed by shadow, which is going to be the foliage. But there's also issues, if you notice, with the trees that are flickering like crazy. That's a volumetric cloud bug that I don't know too much about. By the way, I'm just going to kill some crows.
Of course. As you would.
And the weather is going to change. Oh, there's a dude over here.
That dude was very angry that you killed his crows. Now, it does seem like, based on the stagger system, it's actually fairly easy to isolate an individual enemies. I did notice earlier that stagger regenerates, which we didn't really cover. How fast will it regenerate for the other? Like, is the regeneration rate dynamic, or is that something that is always a constant? Whereas, like, Void Hound regenerates the same rate as you do, for example.
It's going to be different per unit. Some will regenerate quite quickly. Some will not regenerate that quickly at all. There's also a delay after you get hit that it can regenerate. And that's the same for the player, it's the same for the enemies. The fundamentals of that system are the same.
There's a timer on before the regen begins, basically. Okay.
So, for example, for the boss, the concept of the boss that I showed, the wolf, he will have a very low stagger. When you go into him, you're going to be able to knock him down and deal damage to him fairly easily if you can land consistent combos with him. But if you do not stay consistent with it, he will very quickly regenerate back up. So for him, there's a few ways you could try to approach him. One is jousting him. The other is trying to be super aggressive with him. And then he will spawn effects and deal range stuff. He's going to be really complicated. I may not even begin to have him ready by December, especially if something happens in real life, because there's a lot of things you got to learn how to deal with him to deal with it. But with every enemy, it'll be a little different, but the fundamentals of the system will still be there, which is the system awards aggressiveness, and each enemy has characteristics that kind of define it. So we really try to go with how they behave. Like the weeds, for example, their melee is very slow. It doesn't deal damage right now because I don't have it hooked up, but even when I hook that up, the animation speed is still going to be quite slow because their strength really is supposed to rely on how they're playing the map. If you outplay the map and you manage to flank them and catch up to them like I was doing, then you should be able to get good hits on them. Right now, it's kind of hard to land hits on them because I feel like with their small collision size and the overlaps, sometimes there's hits I should be getting that I shouldn't, but also at the same time, I don't really want it to be that much easier. And then again, at the same time, special abilities and stuff like that, I haven't devised any of that yet at all. So that could change the game balance quite a bit when I do. I don't really want to give you super powerful abilities, but I want you to give you special things that you can do or otherwise unlock. One of them is going to be a travel form. You can almost think of it as like a mount, except it will not behave like a mount. It's something you can transform into, like a fox or something like that. You can transform into it anytime in combat or otherwise. It's just if you get hit in it, it's an instant stagger. So it'll have a smaller profile and it'll move faster. I expect that you can use it in combat as well as out of combat for simple navigation, as well as maneuvering the battlefield. That's perfectly fine to me. It is going to change how the balance in the game plays, so we have to think about that. So,
also, if it has like a smaller jump height because it has a smaller profile or whatever, that might also play into things about like how you can navigate stuff. Like maybe you have to be more slow and thoughtful or methodical or whatever under certain circumstances. So yeah, there's
obviously a lot of things to think about, but you probably you might think of this as like Dark Souls, but with more arcade-styled combat, more technical. I like to think of it as Dark Souls, but difficult DMC, but with actual unit design. And, this isn't really a great example for that because my opponents aren't really at the stage where I can point at them and say, hey, this is going to be a difficult game. I've died a couple times, but, it is, the system's not designed. I'm not used to it. I'm talking at the same time or trying to listen or whatever. But at the same time, my target goal is way higher than this, and that's where we're going to be constantly pushing towards. Every time I reach a stage where I feel really comfortable with where I'm at, and like right now with the Void Hounds, I can just mow through them, and they're actually pretty aggressive, but I figured them out and I can mow through them. The time has come to make them much more difficult, and I will just keep ramping them up and just keep ramping them up until I reach a point where I reach the limits of my skill set. So I have a very long-winded, long approach to it, and that's not really how you approach a standard game. A standard game is you make an enemy and they're just there just to do whatever and then not be there again, or be copy pasted into something slightly different color later on or whatever. You don't really try to think of them as really long ways. But I like to think of as your interactions with enemies as a dialogue. And while there will be talking dialogue in this and probably heavier story elements than I really am expecting to have, because there are lots of aesthetics and themes I want to employ, I want every individual fight to be a dialogue. And some fights will probably be really short. Some fights could be prolonged, like dealing with the weeds or with the boss or whatever. I want every fight to be a dialogue, not just with an opponent, but also with yourself and your efforts to overcome an environment, overcome your own limitations, improve and stuff like that. This project, to me, it isn't just about I'm taking ideas from my LPs and stuff I wrote out or tried to do years ago. It's also about trying to encapsulate all the experiences I've had in my real life as well. There's a whole bunch of things I want to kind of bring into this and try to bring them to life within the gameplay. And one of those is, of course, the struggle to survive. And the struggle to survive should be about something more than just mashing square to punch a fucking boulder or something. It should be something that you actually interact with, because life is something you interact with. And this is just a tiny filament. I have like a half dozen other maps I'm working on that are at a comparable level of this, or slightly less complete or whatever. But obviously the opponents is a big thing I'm trying to get working on now, and then
sure, yeah,
I got to do like fix up the menus and everything related. But that's a good demonstration starting point. It's certainly the first time I've shown even anything like this to the public. So hopefully that was interesting and gave you some things to think about, and maybe you have some questions for this.
Yeah. I got about 5-10 minutes here, so we can go over some things before we close out the show. But I definitely, I think this is all very interesting. I obviously am pretty excited to eventually get my hands on the demo, assuming it comes out in December, like you mentioned. That would be pretty cool, because, I mean, realistically speaking, and maybe this is, I don't know, people may or may not be super interested in this line of thinking, but I think when you're really, like, your conversation or your comment about the struggle to survive and the fact that you're building in themes that are heavily imparted from your real life experiences, I feel like doing that consciously is fine, because it's actually just unavoidable in my estimation. It's like, you are an individual, you are your own person. That means your real life experiences are going to follow you around no matter what, and color whatever you're doing no matter what. And you can be introspective and try to tease out those biases if you're trying to be exceedingly neutral or objective or what have you, but there's only a certain point where that's useful or can even be communicated to begin with. I know you're not super interested in making the project itself public, but you have talked about stuff before about how, like, there are certain themes that you want to communicate, there's certain stories or you want to tell or dialogue you want to impart or whatever, and a large portion of that comes from what the player brings to the table. But I don't think you get to the position you're at now without wanting to tell a story to begin with. And that's obviously goes back to your writing and all the other stuff you've done. So despite the fact that it's a private project and it's not going to be released for financial gain or anything like that, it obviously is going to have, there's something to get from it. There's something to take away from it. And that means that there's going to be an aspect of you trying to relate experiences you've had or themes that you want to impart to whoever's playing it, right? And that's interesting to me because of the idea that, I mean, obviously you've had quite a fucking wild ride on this earth. So
yeah, even just the last couple months have been nuts. And
so it's just, it's a lot to go through, but the idea of being able to basically experience, first of all, the idea of like the more selfish or fundamental thing is like, I'd love to play a game that's good, obviously. And so if I can do that, the source almost doesn't even really matter, but obviously I've got a connection with you just based on being an audience member of your content from way back, and now collaborating on casts and on, stuff like where you recently did some voice acting for Cosmonic Brood War. And even before that, you were helping me out with the projects and other aspects. And, obviously to some degree, hopefully I've been helpful on your stuff as well. So there's an idea of like, it's more than just you're some dude on the internet to me. And the idea of being able to finally experience something that, like, actually be able to play something that you've built is definitely an interesting and tantalizing prospect, just because I've seen a lot of content that you've made in, your own demonstration videos or whatever, but it sounds like this will be the first time that, other people, broadly speaking, get to play something of this scale anyway that you've actually been able to complete, which I'm sure is a personal milestone as well for you.
Yeah, at least since Armageddon Onslaught.
Right, yeah.
Because other than that, the only really major release was the audiobook.
Yeah, and then maybe you could say the older conversions for Brood War. But like at this point, for the Apex world at least, it's like definitely the first case of that, which is, I guess we didn't really talk too much about the world, and it might be too much to get into at this point, but I am interested to see the differences between it and the more like Armageddon oriented stuff that I'm a bit more familiar with, but I've only really got what I can glimmer from the some of the developer content and some of the, obviously playing Armageddon Onslaught back then and like experiencing the, like, people say that the people have this really weird bifurcation where they consider lore or story or whatever as completely separate from the gameplay. But obviously there's a gameplay, like you were saying, there's a dialogue in the combat. Well, there's a story being told by the experience of fighting an enemy in an RTS. And so when you fight Armageddon and it takes 7 of you to put it down, then that's obviously an interesting story by itself. And maybe you don't even win anyway. So there's all sorts of interesting things that go into that, I think, that sort of communicate the power level, if nothing else, as well as, personality and stuff. For the opponent. So that's interesting to see how that will be imparted by the enemy design. And obviously the fact that you said that the first enemy that you're going to be fighting is actually a boss is also kind of interesting, because Dark Souls did this in a few cases where it wasn't the first enemy you fought, but it was like the first time you come up against a really difficult challenge. It's supposed to kill you, basically, is the idea. And it's like, I mean, I can see the value in that approach, but I can also see that it seems a bit silly to say like, oh, you're supposed to die at this scene. It feels a bit more rote. It's more like, like obviously you can kill those bosses on the first go or whatever if you're skilled enough, or if you're like doing a speed run or whatever. But it doesn't feel like they designed it to be fair in any capacity, which is obviously a bit of maybe a loaded term, but maybe you can talk a little bit about that first encounter that you plan for players to have.
So fairness is that's something that I think about a lot. Because the whole reason I designed the stagger system as I did is because I didn't like that none of these games exposed hit recovery in a way that you even understood what the fuck was going on. The closest you ever got was Dark Souls with poise, and poise was just a number, which in most cases it just didn't matter. It wasn't something you could really understand or know about, unless maybe somebody reverse engineered it and posted about it on WikiHow or something, or WikiFeet. And that's just terrible. Like, these phone games, for example, they're terrible for this. World of Warcraft's terrible for this. Even like Diablo 2. All these games with all these hidden numbers and math and shit that's changing what's going on, then they just hide this information from you for whatever reason. And I don't like that, particularly with something as important as hit recovery. And I come from Conan and God of War and all these other shitty games where you were just getting stun locked to death by shit all over the place. But at the same time, you don't necessarily want to give people a jail out of free card because they got hit by something and then they just only take health damage. So you wanted to have some kind of hit recovery system in it. So I went to the stagger system. That was because I wanted there to be something that you can physically see and interact with. So if something hits you and deals 5 fucking stagger damage, that's huge. Most things will probably only do 1 or 2 at the maximum, but some things will hit you a lot. Like the bombs will hit a lot because it's literally something you walked into. Now you understand what it does, and it's presented to you in a format that's easy to understand. Or you have stuff like the weed clouds that will deal stagger and then health damage, and all that's laid out plain for you to see, and then you have really nothing more to guess about than the actual interaction concepts. So when it comes to the boss, when you first get into it, yeah, you're gonna die. That's the hope. That's the hope anyways. If you breeze through this, then that's not good. I think in the first however many iterations, people are probably going to breeze through it unless they're really unfamiliar with if the way the movement system and the lack of lock-on completely kills any muscle memory or something that they have, or they're otherwise not familiar with this kind of game, then they might struggle a lot. But I don't want you to die. Like right now, as I mentioned when I was talking about that unit, that he was tracking you because of the strafing thing that I had brought in. I'm going to probably have to build my own strafing system just to ignore that, because I can't change. I've been trying to change that to change the way it moves, and it's just breaking everything. And I don't want him to track you, because that's one of the things I hate the most out of all these fucking games, is especially Souls, they track you to the very end. You can move all around them, and their swing will just fucking follow you. Yeah. And it just takes the whole fucking point out of navigation to begin with, lock on or not. We don't really want that in this. Maybe some points in enemy animations will allow them to reposition. I kind of want the player to be able to reposition a little bit when they first start their attack, but I don't know how that would even feel. I don't even know how to do that yet. So that's just like a consideration. But when it comes to the boss and any of the other fights, for that matter, my engagements, is I don't want things to behave in such a way which feels really unnatural just for the sake of patching up how something works. Like I was talking about the dash, and I can't really demo that. It's kind of a hard thing to demo because I don't really have something that explicitly shows how it works. But the dash, their smart step, as it's called right now, it's early in, but one of the core things I wanted with it is that it checks if it's going to throw them off of a fucking cliff or not, or if they're stuck in a corner, to not waste their action economy. And with the cliff example in particular, you know what most games do? They just put invisible walls there that only affect the AI. That is what they do. You've seen that.
So they still dash in. Yeah, they still dash into it, but they don't get.
They just don't get thrown off the ledge. It's like Dumb Eternal and everything like that. They do this shit all over the place. Invisible walls.
The Jedi game goes one further. You have a move that can push enemies, and you can push enemies off cliffs. But if you try to do it with a specific enemy, they just slide up against the side of the wall for some reason.
Yeah. So that's the accepted medium way of doing it. Is just, and to me that doesn't feel fair. I feel like the AI should be playing the same game that you are, because it's really obvious to the player when an enemy is dashing into the cliff and nothing's happening that they have special needs rules because the developer was too fucking lazy to do things the right way. And doing
even if the player isn't familiar with like why that is happening, they would still know. Oh, they're doing something stupid. It's gonna break the imagination or whatever, or the facade. Well, it's like it's deeper than just immersion. In this case, at least, it's more fundamental. It's like there's the premise of playing a game and interacting with a fantasy world is that there's this well-crafted experience waiting for you to have, and then like even something as simple as something clipping obviously contradicts that premise, and you just break this whole idea that this is something worth doing, or in that moment. I mean, there can be other parts of the game that are good or whatever, but in the moment that you're watching that or witnessing that, it's like, if this is intended behavior, they basically intended for your experience to be incomplete or obviously flawed. And like the leading example sticks out in my craw too, because obviously recently played that Jedi game that we've referenced a few times, and there's an enemy on one of the final areas that when they die, when they take fatal damage, instead of just dying like every other enemy does, they slap you with an aimbot attack that like they basically do this like death rattle thing, but they lead you the whole way through. So you can literally be behind them after killing them, and they'll just spin around in death, or what. Or you can be like jumping over them, and they like wrap like they basically like owl turn, but like forever, like really really fast. Because obviously you're sort of like you can basically be at the same facing angle as them while you're in the air, and they'll just like spaz out. So shit like that is like, really, that's a thing? Like, what are you doing? Because obviously you're used to like health bars or other things being on top of the enemies when you're fighting them, and then the health bar goes away, so you think, oh, they're dead, and then they attack you. It's like totally breaks the whole accepted, like you sort of like, games are like series of promises sometimes, like you can think of them like that, and it's like you just broke the promise that an enemy with no health bar can't hurt me or whatever. Like that's kind of a thing. Of course, I didn't see any health bars in your game. I imagine that's a deliberate decision.
Yeah. So the other thing, like with the first boss fight, I want to introduce a lot of these conventions. Like the difficulty is going to be, the way I see it's going to be scaled. So one of the things I was hoping to show today that I didn't have time to figure out for a variety of reasons is his first range attack, which will be a kunai, which is like a dagger. And he'll throw out waves of them. And those are going to deal the same kind of damage that the Weed's Cloud does, where it deals only stagger damage until you're out of stagger, and that hits you in health. So it's going to introduce you to not only the concept that stagger can be converted into health with certain kinds of attacks, but also to not lose your stagger to begin with. So even from attacks that seem not to be doing damage, and you might think it's okay for me to get hit with stagger damage because it's not dealing full damage and I'll regenerate stagger eventually. The whole goal for the boss at that point is basically wear you down in stagger until he uses a combo attack or something in close range and then actually kills you. Or until he wears you down with the daggers and then keeps you held in stagger. Because he's going to have some switches where when you get staggered in that fight, he will change his aggression and he will go into basically full engagement and will no longer try to avoid you. So there will be a few switches like that in the fight where he changes his behavior depending either on the stage of the fight or what the player's status is. So in that sense, the way that it will be fair will be that this will be paced out in a manner that will make sense. Because the main thing that I understand, like, I think that people who are unfamiliar with a project will have difficulty anyways just because enemies are aggressive, and that's not something you see in this. And while that will give people who are familiar with these games a lot of difficulty because none of the enemies in Dark Souls or DMC or whatever are remotely aggressive, what's going to give them more problems is breaking like sort of like muscle memory of expectations of how things are going to behave or how things are going to act. One thing you also probably notice is that there was not a single thing with a glowing indicator on it. There was no
Thank God.
No maps. No little tooltips or pop-ups or prompts. So there will never be anything like that unless I really absolutely need it for something like maybe like quest specific, which is kind of unlikely. I can't foresee it. There will be no things that hold your hands in that. As it is, I don't want things to be hyper obscure to the point like in Arvatur, one of the objectives is to kill the crow statues. How am I going to tell the player that they need to kill the crow statues without telling them to kill the crow statues? I gotta figure that out, but I'm not gonna have any indicators or anything like that. Now, we were talking about map travel. So those statues that save your checkpoints, those will be used to travel, like bonfires in all likelihood. You'll be able to go back to points that you visited in the past, and they'll probably save the map state that it was currently in, so enemies will remain dead and doors will remain open that you had otherwise opened when you had saved. And that's the key part. So I'll probably keep that in mind. I'm going to be distributing those in such a manner where you do have to put in some kind of effort to actually unlock them. And I'm not going to let you go from map to map using restores in all likelihood. So you can't leave restores open in one map, go to another map, come back if you need health restore to try to game something like that. I'm probably not going to let you do that. The map, your health will probably remain the same status it was in that map, I think. But that's all. That stuff's really hyper subject to change. So, like I said, I have ideas about stuff. I want it to be really hardline about it, but I decided not to be hardline about it. This is still a really hardline system. But any ideas I have, either something that I feel really strongly about, like how the health system currently works, or how the stagger system currently works. I don't usually even consider reading about it. I don't look at other conventions. I don't conform to anything anybody else does. I test it all on my own grounds. I go through my own thought processes for it. And I actually have prepared documents already for when I push this out to people if I get to that stage. I am still not sure if I can even cook the project yet. I haven't really tried it. Well, I did try it earlier and I ran into problems. They might be fixed. I don't know. But presuming we were able to do that, I have a document that basically says, this is what I want feedback on. This is what I don't really want feedback on. And what I don't really want feedback on is stuff like, like, I know shit's fucked. I know there's performance problems. I know a lot of stuff's inconsistent right now. I know the AI doesn't behave like it should, like it's derpy. The Void Hounds, for example, sometimes, so sometimes attack, they don't even hit me. And there's two reasons. For one, the overlaps are not accurate enough. Two, their range is not set up and their animations don't really give them the radius to hit that. So they need a lot of work. I know all that stuff, but the stuff I really want to focus on is like, what color should the player be? Should it be white? Should it be black? White's probably more readable, but it brings up flaws in the model more. What kind of ideas do you have for special abilities that don't break the game balance too much? I don't really want to do huge fundamental changes to the way combat works, but there might be other things I add in or change or adjust or whatever. So it's more like, to me, this is like pre-prototype stuff. But it's still something that I think still it represents an idea that is slowly starting to take shape that's come from all those experiences and all the other stuff. And indeed, talking about the writing is kind of long because you're unlimited time. But the short of it is that this is like a living psychosis, and you're playing what is effectively a goddess, but your vitality is tied to something that's not divine, and that's why you're so frail. But the weapon you have basically can take any shape. It's a divine instrument called Conquest, and that's why I can just cut through projectiles. Before this current iteration, it did actually change shapes for every attack, but I ended up changing a lot of the attacks because I changed the movement sets quite a lot. So, we'll probably go back and some other abilities might change it and have different properties. As it is, I don't know if you'll have different weapons, if you'll be able to swap weapons, because they have to contribute something to the game for me to add it. But I do have animations for that if I really want to do that. So...
yeah, that's the other thing I was curious about. Is obviously we were talking earlier about like New Game Plus and shit. Are there actually going to be progression mechanics, or will you have the full moveset unlocked from the word go?
The first unlock I'm planning to eventually have is a bow. It's a great bow. Right, yes. It's going to function a lot differently than ranged in other games. I haven't gotten into it yet because I don't know how to really do it, but I'm trying to devise a way in my head where you can use a bow without aiming and without auto aim. So I'm thinking it's going to function a lot like artillery, and it's going to behave a lot differently than other stuff. So that's actually what right click is going to be right now. In concept, again, this could change. So then the travel form that I mentioned would also be another similar unlock. So there's going to be no experience. There's no items other than like the keys and other sorts of fluff kind of items like that. You never increase your health or other stuff like that. The same 10 health you've got is the same 10 health you're going to end the game with. That number may change. I feel like it might change when I actually start implementing these major technical bosses I'm talking about, because when I start exploring that, it could lead to all kinds of really major dramatic stuff. But as it is right now, the way I view it is that whatever number you have when you start is when it ends. You progress in the game primarily by becoming better. If there are special abilities, I was thinking of adding something like Trickster from DMC, something like Blink Strike from Final Fantasy 15 or whatever, anything like that, that would be something you unlock. And generally, you will unlock them through optional content. So there may be bosses or hidden areas in places that are extremely high difficulty. And then those functionalities would be locked behind those as opposed to being unlocked through general zone progression. So you would have to progress to a zone to get access to these special areas, but those special areas may not be required to progress. And that's, again, just something to encourage you to explore and to feed into the general idea that the main thing that's going on in this world, the sort of underlying thing, is that your character's identity, and as well as that of conquest in itself, was fragmented, and all the pieces are scattered all over the place, and that they kind of exist between non-existence and existence. And you have these kind of like Cthulhu-esque dark stars trying to hunt you down and destroy you because they want to destroy the goddess of the river, and you're one of her weapons. And they're kind of sort of close to doing that because they've got all this shit fragmented everywhere. So it makes sense that when you find one of these fragments to unlock a piece of your power and remember how to do stuff again, they're going to put some kind of effort into preventing you from getting to that. So those things should be behind very, very challenging content to acquire. So that's my current goal for that. So there will be progression mechanisms in the sense that it enhances your I wanted mostly to give you like options like utility. But as far as like everything I've shown right now, as far as having your advancing strike, your base strike, what they're called is the Ragnarok attacks, which is the ones that tend to be a little more greedy, and everything like that, that'll pretty much all be unlocked from the very beginning.
So that's interesting to me mostly because the first thing that I would want to do is like figure out what the limitations were, or what have you, or what the perceived limitations are. Obviously, like you said, you get better at the game. That's your main method of progression. So I would go back and forth. I would probably agonize over the decision to withhold any aspect of that, like something that's not really exactly related to this genre, but you can maybe have some parallels, is the genre of roguelikes, where you have this idea that you're progressing through this like perhaps procedurally generated world, or there's like elements of randomness that touch the enemy compositions or something, and so you can go through a zone and like experience something different. And so these games often have this system in place where it's not that you get better by playing the game. I mean, hopefully you do, but you also will have more tools to use. And in many respects, like the best case scenario is that you just have more tools that are side grades depending on your personality or playstyle. Yeah. But in most cases, there's like objective improvements in your combat performance that are locked behind essentially grind or just playing the game in a certain way or whatever. Mm-hmm. And that's obviously something that, neither of us are particularly big fans of. So I wasn't expecting anything like that necessarily out of your model, knowing what I know about your design philosophy and what you like in games. But I also am interested in how you'll end up, basically, it's like if you aren't going for a particularly linear approach and you have this unlock system for weapons, my concern would probably be that, like, you might get the bow earlier than intended, for example, and break an area or something like that. And so I would be interested in seeing how you try to triage that system, assuming you get to the point where, like, if you even can travel broadly non-linearly before the unlocks or whatever. Yeah. So I'm sure that's something that you're going to have to
put a lot of effort in. Concern. Because imagine if you have a ranged attack to deal with the weeds, it kills half of the engagement. And then there are other ones that would suffer more than that. So, no, that is absolutely a concern. It's just, evolutions of ideas. And I think I won't have a solid approach to that until I actually put it into it and play it out for myself and then approach it. I don't look to any of these other games and how they do stuff because I feel they've all done it wrong. Progression is honestly really hard to do because it's always hollow at the best of times, and like the example you provided, it ends up becoming mandated because of the way scaling is done, that you need an objective improvement because the stats of these enemies are higher or whatever. That's one of the reasons why I have a strict mandate that you will never improve your health or whatever, because that's going to lead to power creep everywhere else and it gets hard to handle. And at the end of the day, you haven't actually changed the experience between the player and the enemies. Just the numbers got different, and all that does is muddy the water. There's no reason to ever change those numbers once you've got numbers down you feel that are good to play around.
Yeah, well, in the Jedi game, there's a late game upgrade that just doubles your damage, I think. So. Which, by the way, is the only point where enemies feel like they might have reasonable amounts of health, considering you're attacking them with a laser sword that should just cut through stuff, but you have to hit them like 50 times. So.
Yeah.
Love that. No, yeah, one of the things that I'm also interested in, this is probably going to have to be the last question here, is you were talking about, obviously, like the case where the bow may trivialize or break engagements, specifically with the early ranged units. And that made me think, is there going to be a point where is the roster of enemies going to be such that you actually phase them out, not just based on like location, like maybe the Void Hounds are only in some zones or something, or like more likely there'll be like, I saw you were demoing like wolves and bears in the server a while back. And obviously that's a case where it's like, maybe those are only in nature biomes or whatever. I'm curious if you'll just be phasing them out completely insofar as like you get down to like levels 5, 6, 7 or whatever, and or like these later stage worlds where there's going to be a completely different roster, or are you hoping to preserve much of the compositions from world to world?
You will see major changes as time goes on. There are several factions that play in this. Most of them are aligned with each other, which is the Vestigial Stars. And you can think of them as cosmic horror stuff, like massive scale stuff. And the way that this goes is that the more you awaken, the more they awaken. And the more they are drawn to you. And as this happens, the remnant elements of the world, which would be like the natural wildlife and stuff like that, will be overtaken just by their presence, because their presence is as such that it changes the entire world. And then you have another faction, which is the White. And the White is a character that you will run into very early in. And the White will effectively go on a crusade against you. And against the river and everything like that. And the White commands in what is effectively like a phantom undead army of just about everything that's ever died within this circular domain. And a bunch of other shit. And then there's Jormungandr, which is more of an ambient element at first, but becomes more active as time goes on. And you will find that the roster of enemies will evolve over time and dramatically change, even within the scope of a single map, just by actions that you do that draw attention to you. So while I don't have solid ideas in hand, let's say, for example, in the map I demoed, Arvatur. The first portion of the map may have the weeds, which are, those are actually from Jormungandr. They're twisted. Basically, Jormungandr is very existence, and anywhere that is darkness causes worlds to change. And then it changes the identity of things, so weeds become more or less demons. And that's what those are. But they're still just very simple creatures. Of course, once you do something like, say, smash the crow statues and start stirring a lot of shit, that starts drawing a lot of attention. Then you're going to see the next major things start popping up because they've been drawn to you. So, as a reference, all this stuff actually was and is from my D&D games as well. So, these are actually characters and some of the locations as well that were played out in D&D, and some characters from the D&D, including the player characters, may end up showing up in here. So there's a lot to go through when you get into the real weeds for that. But yes, absolutely, you will start seeing some really major stuff, as even depending on where you go and what you do fairly early in. But as we go later on, things will just get more and more crazy, and the environments will get more and more psychotic. Things will get more and more twisted, and then eventually you'll be fighting, like demigods and stuff like that are hurling all kinds of shit at you, and you really will be faced with the polarity that is, you have this power, but it's restricted by the vitality that you're in because of the state that you're in, because of the world that you're in. But the weapon that you have still possesses this immense ability to destroy things. And that's where the coming in of destroying projectiles and other ambient effects that they produce will be critical. And again, that kind of circles us right back to reinforcing playing the map, playing the environment, playing around enemy behaviors and understanding those behaviors and what they want to do is very important versus, them always reacting to you or forcing you to react to them. There'll be an actual interaction, a dialogue, again, between you and the opponents. And that's really what we want to reinforce. And what you're going to see with the tiers is that while enemies will get up in scale and use more dramatic abilities or more directly dangerous abilities, is what I also want them to do is to take much more advantage of the map. So say, for example, you have the weed right now. It fires one projectile. It tries to move around. A higher, more advanced unit may, for example, spawn things in corners, find choke points, choose those retreat locations and build warp gates to them. I was conceptualizing a unit earlier today where it ignores the player completely, never attacks you. It's just a probe that runs around building towers and shit, and then the towers do the attacking, and you pretty much have to force a fight with it to get it to do anything to you. Other than that, it just kind of roams around the map like an ambient element doing its own thing, and if you just ignore it, then it just starts making trouble for you as time goes on. So the maps will be alive. There will be things like that go on where enemies are navigating around and doing stuff. And one of the things I did not show is the spawner that I have, because it's not really worth showing yet. But there are just stuff that will happen, and the world will be alive. And I guess some of the factions will be hostile to each other as well, and you can try to take advantage of that. So that may be, even a strategy you have to employ in some maps if you're not skilled enough to deal with these really major threats, is to try to get them all up in each other's shit instead. So, again, I would have liked to have shown some of that more advanced stuff at this point, but we're obviously well beyond that point. Maybe by December we'll have some of that to show you.
Cool. Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing how things evolve. Obviously, I haven't had, like I said earlier, haven't had my eyes glued to the channel necessarily, but if people are also interested and maybe haven't even heard of this before, on the Discord server, Mesk does have a channel, which I believe currently is not public, which is obviously your discretion. I don't remember if you made it public to anybody.
No,
who joins,
I wouldn't.
Yeah. So in that case, I guess you'll have to be a member of the Fraudience member. You'll have to become one of those. So that just means being reasonable and active. So it should be pretty easy if you're interested in getting more details about this, seeing the development as time goes on. Obviously, you can join the server and ask him questions no matter what. But to follow up to date, that's our version of Patreon. We don't make you pay money. You just have to actually be a human being. So that's pretty cool.
You have to be an admin of WikiFeet.
There you go. Yeah, you can also trade. You can pay Mesk in feet pictures instead of content. So
especially burnt chicken legs.
So on that note, I guess that's pretty much it. That's all the questions I have time for anyway. I do have a lot more to say, but I think we'll just come back with another episode.
Yeah, we can come back any time and go through stuff, or I could demo something specific if you want to get into it or whatever. So
yeah. I mean, I'm sure a lot of it will just be about interaction concepts and whatnot. Like I'm interested in things about, like, I guess a final word is one of the things that was interesting is when you said obviously earlier you said the way you progress through the game is you get better, but also in the lore you said that you awaken more, and so too do your opponents, and that's kind of, I imagine that's very deliberate, and it's very much like a synchronicity between the idea of you becoming better as a player and like your character reflecting that by becoming more awakened in that sense. So it'll be interesting to see that in action and stuff. And hopefully you showed enough that you're satisfied with the demo, and hopefully the people who watched it are also the same way. I don't know if you have any sort of closing thoughts or final words for us here, but that'll probably do it.
Not really. It's a little bit of a mess. I did kind of jog through a whole bunch of it, but we did get to see Arvatur, and obviously, everything has got a lot. I know I got a lot to do with it to patch it up, but I'm always keeping an eye out for something to use for the player character. That's an improvement, but I don't think it's going to happen. I've actually scoured the entire internet for a good 2 years. Since I am willing to re-weight something and go through that process, even if it takes another month, if I find a better solution that fits the criteria I'm after. Otherwise, I think we're in a good spot. It's just I hope that real life stays stable so I can actually get to work on it, because a lot of what I just showed you, including that whole map, Arvatur, the whole just about everything in the demo scene that was not like the weight painting and stuff like that, and the Void Hound was done in the last month or so. So the Templar was the last month. The Wolf Dude was the last 2 days. Everything. The Weed was a week or two ago, other than the Cloud that was kind of recent. And a lot of other internal stuff I did not show. Again, the music system and a lot of audio related stuff that I can't show. And just all kinds of shit, fixing level stuff, for example. All that was done just within like a month or two. So when I actually have time and energy and I'm not overburdened by, people dying or whatever, I can actually get work done on this, even though it's really just a lot of me getting confused by my own stupidity. There's most of the mistakes in this are just all my own, and I confuse myself for hours at a time just because I don't really have a programmatic mindset. Like it's been a long and very hard process to get into the programmatic mindset, because usually I overcomplicate things and thinking how I need to do them, and it can make things really hard to figure out even really simple stuff. So a lot of that time is really just me being stupid. So hopefully I can continue to work on it, at least for a little while, before things get really bad, because they're getting pretty bad.
Yeah, let's pour one out for the homie. Praise, thoughts and prayers and feet pics for the idea that maybe Mesk will actually be able to continue doing work at a reasonable pace for once. So that would
One
be pretty
like
cool.
equals 1 feet pic.
There you go. That's our way of telling you to like this video and subscribe to the channel and all that other stuff that I don't hear anymore since you started using Sponsor Block. So
God bless. God bless Sponsor Block. It's probably one of the best fucking add-ons ever made.
Preach.
I don't use YouTube hardly at all, but when I do, I use Sponsor Block.
And with that, caw.
Caw!